Is all about.
To kill the president?
Also, I didn't keep
How'd you get the black eye?
Sir?
You shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man! Come on, man. President?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
President?
Tonight on Frontline, lone gunman, conspirator, or patsy? Who was Lee Harvey Oswald?
He was living a secret life.
Oswald looked very suspicious to the KGB.
He was in control of the FBI then. They didn't know for sure if he was an agent or not.
No, sir, I'm not a communist. And,
He lives in this fantasy about being a great man.
He thought capitalism was wrong and it needed to be overthrown.
Here comes Oswald down the hall again.
No one saw him actually pull the trigger on the president.
I emphatically deny these charges.
It was terribly important that he be silenced.
Tonight, a Frontline special report on the man at the center of the crime of the century. The mysterious life of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. This is Frontline.
At the edge of downtown Dallas, the Union Pacific Railroad crosses a triple underpass near a place called Dealey Plaza. On the north side of Dealey Plaza are the Dallas County Jail, the courthouse, and the Texas School Book Depository. In Dealey Plaza, it is always November 22nd, 1963.
I noticed that there are a number of hidden zippers in these jackets. Now, what are these for, Betsy? They can't be for... Is it for mad money?
Well, it depends on where they're placed. They can be wherever you want them.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You'll excuse the fact that I'm out of breath, but about 10 or 15 minutes ago, a tragic thing, from all indications at this point, has happened in the city of Dallas. Let me quote to you this. And you'll excuse me if I am out of breath. A bulletin. This is from the United Press from Dallas. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. They were riding an open automobile when the shots were fired. School Book Depository, headed for the triple underpass. There were three loud, reverberating...
Shots were fired. He happened to look up at about the 5th or 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository. He said he saw the rifle being pulled back in. President Kennedy.
Bert, let's see. Let's get reorganized here. Grab that cable over there. We're on the air, Bert, and let's talk to you.
Officials were en route as fast as they could get there to Parkland Hospital.
This is what I've been told now, Jay. The President was shot in the head. Connally was shot in the chest. Both of them are still alive when I left the hospital.
Do you have some film?
And, yeah, I have film at the hospital.
You get the film and see if you can get it developed real quick.
Yeah, I
we'll
will.
Put on the air.
And,
a priest has been ordered. Emergency supplies of blood also being rushed to the hospital. Just a moment. Just a moment. We have a bulletin.
The gentleman just walked in our studio that I am meeting for the first time, as well as you. This is WFAA-TV in Dallas, Texas. May I have your name, please, sir?
My name is Abraham Zapruder.
Mr. Zapruder?
Zapruder, yes, sir.
Zapruder. And would you tell us your story, please, sir?
I got out and about a half hour earlier, getting to a good spot to shoot some pictures. As the president was coming down from Houston Street making his turn, it was about halfway down there, I had a shot. And he slumped to the side like this. Then I had another shot or two. I couldn't say what it was, one or two. And I saw his head practically open up, all blood and everything. And I kept on shooting. That's about all. I'm just sick. I can't.
I think that pretty well expresses the entire feelings of the whole world.
Less than 1 hour after the president was pronounced dead, police had arrested a suspect. Lee Harvey Oswald was a 24-year-old former Marine who had once defected to the Soviet Union. Only weeks earlier, he had visited the Soviet and Cuban embassies.
The original complaint that the police department filed on Lee Oswald around midnight on the 22nd of November said that Lee Oswald did, in furtherance of an international communist conspiracy, assassinate President John F. Kennedy.
That night, as Air Force One brought John Kennedy's body home to Washington, the new president was afraid that Oswald's apparent communist connections could spark an international crisis. President Johnson ordered the district attorney to drop any reference to a communist conspiracy.
This is a sad time for all people.
Johnson was fearful that if this had gotten out, it would flame public opinion and could possibly lead to World War III. This is exactly how World War I began, with an assassination.
Imagine the new president's predicament. This was just a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world came to the brink of nuclear war. What does he do? He calls in Chief Justice Earl Warren, tells him that he must, as Chief Justice, chair the Commission of Investigation. The Commission of Investigation goes ahead and effectively puts the lid on the whole thing, and that meant hiding things in order to keep the peace.
9 months later, the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald had acted alone. But for 30 years, its findings have been under attack. In 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassination said there was a probable conspiracy to kill the president. And thousands of books and films have accused the mafia, right-wing oil men, anti-Castro Cubans, Fidel Castro, the Pentagon, the KGB, the FBI, the CIA, and even Lyndon Johnson of murdering John Kennedy.
Increasingly in the last 30 years, Oswald has become a footnote to the story. He is lost under a deluge of details about trajectory angles and ballistics and forensics and possible plotters. We have no understanding in this sterile presentation of him, of his real character and what motivates him.
Lone gunman, conspirator, or patsy? Was Oswald controlled by private political passion, or by his apparent connections to virtually every group with a strong motive to kill President Kennedy?
Any effort to explain what happened in Dallas must explain Lee Harvey Oswald. And Lee Harvey Oswald is a mystery wrapped up in an enigma, hidden behind a riddle. He is not, I put it in simple words, an easy man to explain.
30 years later, the many mysteries of Oswald's short life are still at the heart of the enduring question: who killed John Kennedy?
He is God. Oswald. It is Oswald. You're all.
He was born October 18, 1939, in New Orleans, the son of Marguerite and Robert Oswald. But his father died suddenly of a heart attack 2 months before Lee's birth. Marguerite Oswald was left alone to care for Lee and his 2 older brothers, his half-brother John and Robert.
You go back to the death of his dad 2 months before he was born, that's a tremendous impact. What Lee missed from his childhood in comparison to me was the whole family being together all the time, the continuity there, the stability, the lack of stability, I think, entered into that to a large degree.
Marguerite sent the older boys into an orphanage and later to boarding school. Lee stayed at home with his mother.
I don't know at what age Mother verbalized to Lee the effect that she felt he was a burden to her. But certainly by age 3, he had the sense that, you know, we were a burden.
When he was 3 years old, Lee, too, was sent to the orphanage. Like Lee, Marguerite herself grew up without a parent. It was their common bond.
She had certain characteristics that were so much like Lee. The time and circumstances always seemed to be against her. The world owed her a living. She wanted to be somebody. I think this was passed on to Lee.
Later, Lee summed up his own childhood.
The son of an insurance salesman whose early death that left a far-mean streak of independence brought on by neglect.
At 12, Lee and his mother moved to New York. They lived in a small apartment in the Bronx. While Marguerite worked days in a dress shop, Lee spent his time alone. He went often to the Bronx Zoo. The zoo had become a haven for Lee, who seemed to prefer the company of animals to that of people. He was enrolled in the 8th grade, but had not set foot in school for almost 2 months. On March 11th, he was noticed at the zoo by a truant officer and taken to court. He was sent to a youth detention center for 3 weeks of psychiatric evaluation. His social worker was Evelyn Siegel.
I remember him vividly. He was a skinny, unprepossessing kid. He was not a mentally disturbed kid. As a matter of fact, his IQ was better than average. He was just emotionally frozen. He was a kid who had never developed a really trusting relationship with anybody.
Lee thought he had better ways to spend his time than in school. He spent his days at the public library and museums, and endless hours learning the New York City subway system.
From what I could garner, he really interacted with no one. He made his own meals. His mother left at around 7 and came home at 7, and he shifted for himself. You got the feeling of a kid, nobody gave a darn about him. He was just floating along in the world with no emotional resources at all.
This is the story, the fantastically true story of Herbert A. Philbrick, who for 9 frightening years did lead 3 lives. Average citizen, high-level member of the Communist Party, and counter-spy for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What's the matter, comrade? Trouble? Got a cigarette, Herb? Yeah.
His favorite TV program was a saga of political intrigue and espionage.
I led 3 lives. He became really engrossed in that particular television show. I think he just liked the atmosphere that you could do anything that you wanted to do that you could imagine you could do.
Herbert A. Philbrick, successful communist. His party's pride. He'll lie for the party, spy for the party, report his best friend to the party as a deviationist liberal.
At the same time, very real events were making a lasting impression on Lee. In 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were sentenced to death as Russian spies. Journalist Edward J. Epstein traces Lee's political awakening to this moment.
The first instance we have of Lee Harvey Oswald's politics is that he picked up a leaflet in New York City about the coming execution of the Rosenbergs. And as he reads this, it begins to show him that there's a way of finding himself by opposing the established order.
I was looking for a key to my environment, and then I discovered socialist literature. I had to dig for my books in the back dusty shelves of libraries.
When the truant officer came after Lee again, he and his mother fled New York. They moved back to New Orleans, to the edge of the French Quarter. But their home was far from the tourists on Bourbon Street.
That street at that time was one den of iniquity after another. Strip joints, gambling joints. It was a place where every hustler and pimp in New Orleans applied his trade. Oswald grew up in a community and environment of crime and corruption.
Dear sir, I am 16 years of age and would like more information about your youth league.
His interest in socialism may have diverted Lee from the vices of his neighborhood. He tried to join the Socialist Party's youth league, but there was no chapter in New Orleans.
I am very interested in your YPSL. Sincerely, Lee Oswald.
Instead, he joined the Civil Air Patrol, a youth auxiliary of the Air Force. He tried to lie his way into the Marines, but he was rejected as too young. Just after his 17th birthday, Oswald enlisted.
Hello, Technique! Hello, Technique! Get up there now!
It was 1956, the height of the Cold War. And the young socialist had become an instrument of U.S. foreign policy.
To him, the Marine Corps was a vehicle for escaping from all the things that were holding him down in his life. Look what he got as a Marine. He learned to use a rifle, he learned to travel, and he got away from his family.
What meter line are we at right now? 200. Is that 200 meters? All right.
Oswald received extensive training in marksmanship. Fellow Marines remember him as a poor shot, but the record indicates otherwise.
He shoots on a rifle range 212, which means he qualifies for the second highest position in the Marine Corps, that of a sharpshooter. Near the end of his stay in the Marines in 1959, he went back to requalify himself in the range, still shot 191, and still qualified as a marksman.
The sergeant in charge of his training called Oswald a slightly better than average shot for a Marine. Excellent by civilian standards. Oswald requested to be a radar controller. He received training and then shipped out for what would be his first great foreign adventure, a posting at Atsugi, Japan.
What he arrived at Atsugi Air Base in Japan wasn't simply an Air Force defense base. It was a CIA base, and the CIA program taking place at that base involved one of America's most secret and important reconnaissance missions, the spy plane which became famous as the U-2 plane.
The U-2's mission was to invade Russian airspace and photograph Soviet strategic sites. Its flying altitude was a closely guarded secret, but one that radar operators like Oswald and his colleague Dan Powers could have learned.
On occasion, we would get aircraft calling into the bubble at Atsugi that would ask us for the winds aloft at 70 and sometimes 100,000 feet, and we just didn't realize there were aircraft at that particular point in time that could fly that high.
Oswald's posting at Atsugi and his later defection to Russia have fueled speculation that Oswald was recruited as a spy.
One of the things that I found out from questioning Oswald's associates in the Marine Corps was that he wasn't living the life of an ordinary Marine. He was living what you might call a secret life. He was moving to a type of bars and nightclubs which weren't for the purpose of socializing, but were for the purpose of making contacts.
One day, a fellow Marine noticed Oswald heading off limits with a Eurasian woman he assumed was a prostitute.
There's a small business section across one bridge that was called Skivvy Bridge. We were allowed as Americans to go into that sector of the residential portion of Iwakuni. The other sector was considered to be communist, Japanese communists, and it was an off-limits area that we were not allowed to go in as Americans. The first time I saw Oswald with the round eye, she was a beautiful white Russian. He was walking with her. They were going across the bridge into the section that was off limits to us.
Lee ventured off base often and later claimed he met with radical Japanese students. But U.S. intelligence says he never contacted the Soviets directly, and there's no hard evidence he was part of an American spy mission. So what was Oswald up to?
I think from the entire pattern of Oswald's life, he was trying to find people who could use the information he was acquiring in the Marines, which he thought was valuable, whether or not it was. He was trying to find another way of moving his life a step ahead. And he saw these Japanese contacts, as he later saw contacts elsewhere, as a way of getting him to the next stage of his journey.
But Oswald's Marine career kept running into roadblocks. He found himself increasingly at odds with his superiors.
Oswald enters the Marines with such high hopes, but it quickly unravels for him. Just a year after entering, he wounds himself with a pistol that he's not supposed to have, and as a result, he's court-martialed. And then he's put on KP duty for a very long stint. He's very dissatisfied with it. Eventually, he attacks the sergeant that he believes is responsible for his long KP service in a bar and challenges him to a fight. Then he's court-martialed a second time. This time he's put into the brig. And this has an effect on him. The brig is very hard. And when he comes out, he's now an embittered person.
Oswald started learning Russian, and he began openly espousing the virtues of Marxism to fellow Marines.
If you complained about, oh, we've got to go on a march this morning, or we've got to do this morning, scrub barracks, or whatever we had to do, if you were complaining about it, he would say that that was the capitalist form of government making us do these things. Karl Marx and his form of government would alleviate that.
Questions have been raised about why Oswald was never disciplined for such un-American activity.
This man was a man with a security clearance. This man was a man who had access to highly sophisticated materials, and he is now showing an interest in Marxism. In retrospect, I think that what this indicates, and this was the judgment of the committee, is that our own people aren't as efficient as we might think they ought to be. That more often than not, it's Keystone Cops and not stainless steel efficiency. And that we drew ultimately no sinister inference from our own people's failure to take action or even to investigate Oswald in any way.
During the end of his duty in California, Oswald carefully prepared his next move. First, he applied to a college in Switzerland. Then he applied for an early discharge. The day after it was approved, he applied for a passport. He secretly planned to go to Russia.
Oswald didn't defect to the Soviet Union on a sudden impulse. We know that. This was well planned, and the question is, could Oswald have planned this alone, or did he have help?
Oswald's route to Moscow was complicated. He journeyed from New Orleans to Europe, where he moved quickly from France to England, then to Finland. Helsinki was one of the few cities in the world where an American could get a visa to Russia on short notice. From there, Oswald boarded a train for Moscow. Where did he get the money for his extensive travels? He later claimed he had saved over $1,000 while in the Marines, but records show he had only $200 in his bank account. As a deluxe class tourist, Oswald received the personal attention of his own in-tourist guide, Rima Shirakova.
I took him for an excursion around the city. We went to the
most important sites of Moscow, such as Tretyakov Art Gallery, the cathedrals, and the treasury of the Moscow Kremlin.
But Oswald seemed uninterested in the sights. On their second day, he told Rima his real reason for coming. He wanted to defect.
I was shocked. I asked his motives, his reasons, and he said that it was his political views. He said that he was a communist. He doesn't approve of the American way of life.
With Rima as their go-between, the KGB considered Oswald's request. The former head of the KGB who handled Oswald's case is Vladimir Semichastny. It's only now that men like Semichastny can tell the KGB's version of events.
When he came to us and began to ask for asylum here so insistently, the first reaction was to refuse and not to give him permission to stay in the Soviet Union, let alone to give him political asylum.
Later, Oswald recorded his reaction in what he called his historic diary.
I must leave country tonight at 8 p.m. as visa expires. I am shocked. My dreams, I retire to my room.
That same afternoon, we were to meet downstairs as usual. Some time passed, but he didn't appear. Certainly I was nervous and wanted to know what had happened. So that's why I rushed upstairs. I knocked at the door, but there was no answer.
Hotel security men finally broke down the door.
We all tumbled in the room, and behind the shoulders of the two men, I saw Lee in the bath. It was water there, and it was reddish, so it was blood. Lee cut his wrist.
Oswald was rushed unconscious to Botkin Hospital. His wounds were quickly stitched up and bandaged. He was then transferred to the psychiatric ward. Dr. Lydia Mikhailena was on duty when Lee arrived.
It was my impression immediately that this was a sure suicide attempt, since he was refused political asylum, which he had been demanding. And he tried to obtain permission to stay in the Soviet Union by inflicting the wounds.
After 7 days, Oswald was ready to be discharged. That day, Dr. Mikhailena got a call from the KGB asking her to hold him until they arrived.
Sometime later, about 40 minutes, a large black car arrived and 3 young men came in. They confiscated his medical history, his discharge paper, and all his documents. And then they told me they were taking him away.
For 30 years, the KGB maintained that it never interrogated Oswald about his military service. Until now.
There were conversations, but this was such outdated information. The kind we say the sparrows have already chirped to the entire world. And now Oswald tells us about it. Not the kind of information that would interest such a high-level organization like ours.
Still, Semichastny conceded the KGB considered recruiting Oswald as a spy.
Counterintelligence and intelligence, they both looked him over to see what he was capable of. But unfortunately, neither could find any ability at all.
Oswald was moved to a hotel while the KGB considered his fate. After 3 days, he decided he'd had enough.
It seems like 3 years. I must have some sort of a showdown.
On October 31st, he went to the U.S. Embassy and demanded to see the consul, Richard Snyder.
They put a piece of paper on my desk. It said, I have come to revoke my American citizenship. I have applied for Soviet citizenship. He also volunteered the information that he'd been, while in the Marines, he'd been a radar technician. And that when he became a Soviet citizen, he intended to offer to the Soviet authorities everything that he had learned.
Snyder reported Oswald's threat to Washington, where the Marines began proceedings for an undesirable discharge and changed their radar codes. The embassy also suggested to reporter Priscilla McMillan that she should try to interview Oswald.
He spoke with a quiet manner and a little southern accent. He spoke so quietly that it wasn't until later, when I looked at my own notes, that I realized that the content of them was very angry. He said he did not want to live like a worker under capitalism, the way that his mother did, and be exploited all his life. And therefore he wanted to come live in the Soviet Union. He seemed lonely. He seemed very, very young. He seemed lost in a situation that was beyond him.
I was delivering milk on a milk route in Fort Worth, and a taxi cab pulled up, and a reporter gets out and asks me if I'm Robert Oswald, you know, and I said yes, and he's showing me an AP or UPI wire that saying that Lee Harvey Oswald was defecting in Moscow, trying to turn into citizenship. And I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I was floored. It was a complete surprise.
Meanwhile, word of Oswald's suicide attempt had reached the top levels of the Kremlin. Yekaterina Frotseva, seated just behind Nikita Khrushchev, was the highest-ranking woman in the Politburo. Frotseva became Oswald's champion and demanded the KGB reverse its decision and allow him to stay.
If he's begging, to hell with him. Let him stay here in order to avoid an international scandal on account of such a nobody. We were not convinced this would be his last act of blackmail. We expected he would try again, which would be difficult to deal with in Moscow. So we decided to send him to Minsk.
His ordeal in Moscow over, Oswald now had the chance to become what he had always wanted to be, a model young Marxist. Soviet authorities set him up in style. Despite a chronic housing shortage, he was given a choice apartment, a luxury unheard of for a young bachelor.
He found himself, according to his own reporting of it in his diary, living a life that was much more luxurious and much more respectable than the life he had lived anywhere else in his young life. He had the possibility of being respected. He had a good job. He was given a very good position.
Oswald built prototypes of new models at the Minsk radio and television factory. As in the Marines, he got off to a good start. Leonid Zagoyka worked with Oswald.
When he started work after his training, he joined the team. He fit in well and worked well too.
Thinking that Lee sounded like a Chinese name, his co-workers dubbed him Alec, but he remained a mystery to them.
May Day came as my first holiday. After a spectacular military parade, all workers parade past the reviewing stand, waving flags and pictures of Mr. Khrushchev, etc. I follow the American custom of marking a holiday by sleeping in the morning.
Vyacheslav Nikonov was an aide to the first KGB chief after communism. He reviewed the entire Oswald file.
Oswald looked very suspicious to the KGB and to the factory authorities because he was not interested in Marxism. He didn't attend any Marxist classes, he didn't read any Marxist literature, and he didn't attend even the labor union meetings. So the question was, what was he doing there?
The KGB kept Oswald under constant surveillance and co-opted most of the people he met, including his best friend, Pavel Golobachev.
I was met by one of their people, and it was like this. He said, your country asks you, your country demands. There is a foreigner here. It's in the country's interest for security and so on. That was early on, but I told him about it a year later. I had 3 or 4 meetings with the KGB people. They gave me little assignments to provoke him, saying, try this out on him and see what he says.
When Oswald asked some fellow workers if he could go hunting with them, the KGB became alarmed.
The fear of KGB was that Oswald will take a gun, go to the forest, and approach some military installations, secret military installations near Minsk. And so this company of people, when hunting, was also joined by some KGB agents.
Oswald's co-worker Leonid Zagoyko was also along that day.
We set off to hunt. There were 5 of us. I was last. Suddenly, a shot rang out. I asked Oswald, why are you shooting? He said, look, a hare. The others fired too, but missed. And then we all stopped and discussed why he had shot too soon. He explained that the hare had jumped from under his feet, and he was startled, and so he shot. I said, you could have killed me. Your gun was pointing right at me. We didn't take him again, because the head of our group had been warned not to.
Shunned by his co-workers, Oswald befriended some college students interested in learning English. He became fast friends with Ernst Titovets.
I rather gave him all the credit of him being a very highly educated and cultured man when I first met him. Well, he was an American, and the United States was a country of high reputation here in this country.
Titovets made tape recordings of Oswald to study his southern accent.
The door of Henry's lunch counter opened and 2 men came in. They sat down at the counter. What's yours, George Jackson?
I gave him rather chance pieces to read, and those happened to be, well, Shakespeare, from Othello, Ernest Hemingway.
The 2 men at the counter read the menu. From the other end of the counter, Nick Adams watched.
Titovets also interviewed Oswald in mock dialogues. This is the first time the tapes have been heard publicly. In one interview, Lee played the part of a killer.
Will you tell us about your last killing? Well, it was a young girl under a bridge. She came in carrying a loaf of bread, and I just cut her throat from ear to ear. What for? Well, I wanted the loaf of bread, of course. Well, okay.
And what do you take to be your most famous killing in your life?
Well, the time I killed 8 men on the Bowery, the sidewalk there, they were just standing there loafing around. I didn't like their faces, so I just shot them all with a machine gun. It was very, very famous. All the newspapers carried the story.
We're just having a great time, and actually we're laughing our heads off.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will to the best...
The day after John Kennedy's inauguration in 1961, Lee's mother arrived at the White House to ask for help in locating her son. She was not the only one asking questions. No one had heard from Oswald for over a year. Recently released documents show that several government agencies began tracking Oswald in Russia.
These files clearly show that there's hardly an intelligence agency that did not have an interest in Lee Harvey Oswald. Navy intelligence was worried about radar secrets he may have given to the Russians. The FBI was concerned that an imposter might be using his papers to sneak into the United States, and the CIA had both a positive and a counterintelligence interest.
The people who handled these files and who read them were branch chiefs and division chiefs and senior staff people in the clandestine services. What this all adds up to is a very significant level of interest in this man.
Ironically, by that winter, Oswald decided he wanted to leave the Soviet Union.
The work is drab. The money I get has no way to be spent. As my Russian improves, I become increasingly conscious of just what sort of a society I live in.
He had become disillusioned with life here. He came here after reading a lot of Marx and Lenin, thinking that it was something good. But living here, he realized it was not so good.
Then one night, he went to a dance at the Palace of Culture. A friend introduced him to Marina Prusakova.
She was a very attractive lady. She dressed well. We went up to her with Lee Harvey Oswald, and he said straight away that he would like to get to know her. We were standing right here, beside that column. Of course, he fell in love with her straight away, at first sight, as we say in Russia.
Marina Oswald declined to be interviewed for this program, but she did talk to writer Priscilla McMillan. McMillan befriended Marina after the assassination and wrote an intimate portrait of the Oswalds' life together.
Marina liked Lee for several reasons. One was that he was polite. She liked his being foreign. She thought that an American would treat her better than a Russian. Marina worked as a pharmaceutical assistant, and shortly after they met, a few days after they met, he was hospitalized for trouble with his adenoids, and Marina went to visit him in the hospital. She did visit him several times, and by the time he was released from the hospital, he asked her to be his fiancée.
6 weeks after they met, a hasty wedding party was arranged at the home of Marina's uncle. Because her uncle worked for Soviet domestic intelligence, questions have been raised about whether Marina herself was an agent.
As for Marina, about whether she had been planted by the KGB as his wife, I was often asked this question, and I can say with authority that nothing of the sort happened. If we had done such a thing, we would have done it with a bit more finesse, not so crudely as they did their own wedding.
The KGB continued to bug the apartment and monitor everything that went on inside.
They married and they had a girl very soon. I don't think they were the happiest family in the world. They had a lot of quarrels all the time, and even some fights.
Lee was still determined to return to the U.S. with Marina and his daughter June. He persisted for 18 months until Soviet and U.S. authorities granted permission.
We concluded that he was not working for American intelligence. His intellectual training, experience, and capabilities were such that it would not show the FBI and the CIA in a good light if they used people like him.
Oswald's 2.5-year Russian journey was over. On June 2nd, 1962, Lee, Marina, and June left for America. Oswald assumed the press would flock to hear his story.
He had prepared answers and statements, anticipating reporters either at the ship or someplace down the line on the return. And I think he was surprised when he stepped off the plane in Dallas Love Field. He asked me, "What, no reporters?" I said, "Yes, I've been managed to keep it quiet." And that was it. So I think he was disappointed.
Lee moved back in with his brother in Fort Worth. Soon after, the FBI interviewed him about his time in the Soviet Union.
Oswald appeared at the Fort Worth resident agency and was interviewed by two agents who happened to be in the office. This interview did not turn out to be too successful because Oswald was in an aggressive, surly mood, and they finally broke the interview off after a little while.
According to the FBI report, Oswald's answers were evasive.
He said they even asked me, you know, if I'd ever been an agent of the federal government or the CIA. He says, "Well, don't you know?" And he just laughed. He was in control of the FBI then. They didn't know for sure if he was an agent or not. He was toying with them, and he toyed with people like that.
Officially, the FBI was the only agency that questioned Oswald. It has always been a mystery why the CIA, which had a growing file on Oswald, maintains it never talked to him.
The FBI would certainly interview him for counter-espionage purposes and to try and find out whether the KGB had recruited him, whether he was going to be somebody that they had to continue to watch, what his motives were, and all the rest of those things. And it was the FBI's responsibility, and if they interviewed him once or twice, that would seem to me to have been adequate.
One former CIA officer, however, says he read an agency debriefing of Oswald in 1962. Donald Denslia still does undercover work, but agreed to be interviewed in shadow.
I received across my desk a debriefing report. It was a debriefing of a Marine redefector. He was returning with his family from the Soviet Union and was back in the United States. The report was approximately 4 to 5 pages in length. It gave a lot of details about the organization of the Minsk radio plant. It was signed off by a CIA officer by the name of Anderson.
This is that missing document. The internal document note of September 28, 1960.
Frontline researchers poured through Oswald's recently declassified CIA file at the National Archives. They found hard evidence which supports Denslia's story.
Oh, security.
We're very interested in the marginalia and the handwritten notes on these files, and one day I picked up a piece of paper and turned it over and could see through the back. I could read handwriting that said, Andy Anderson, 00 on Oswald. Later on, we found out that 00 really is the symbol, the office symbol for the Domestic Contacts Division, which would have had the debriefing mission on Oswald had there been one.
Frontline showed the document to former Director Helms.
I know of no contact that was made by CIA with Oswald when he returned to the United States. There may have been one, but I'm not aware of it, and I'm not able to shed any light on who it would have been.
And this document doesn't change your mind?
And that document doesn't change my mind in the slightest.
Frontline interviewed over 30 CIA officers off the record, including a former deputy chief of domestic contacts. He confirmed Denslea's story that the CIA had debriefed Oswald. It was just a routine contact, he said.
My feeling is at this point the report is buried somewhere. I don't know where it is, but I'm sure it's probably in a contacts division somewhere or in one of the other filing systems at the agency.
Several CIA officers remembered an Andy Anderson who worked for domestic contacts. The CIA has not responded to Frontline's request to identify Anderson. What now seems certain is that the CIA is still covering up its contact with Lee Harvey Oswald. Was it just a routine interview or something more? And why has it remained hidden for 30 years? In the autumn of 1962, the Oswalds moved to Dallas. They were befriended by a group of Russian emigres who helped them settle in. One of them, George de Mohrenschildt, had originally come from Minsk. He took a special interest in Lee.
I actually believe that he was a very sincere person, and with me he was extremely sincere, because I treated him almost like a son of mine. You know, he could have been a son by his age, or as a soldier in my regiment.
De Mohrenschildt helped Oswald find a job at a photo lab downtown, where he worked beside David Offstein.
I met Lee Oswald when he came to work for Jaggers Child Stovall in October of 1962, and was involved in training him on the equipment we used in the photographic department. About a month or two after Lee came to work for us, he asked me what the company policy was about using the company equipment for making personal photographs, enlargements of personal pictures, family pictures, that sort of thing. I told him at the time that the company policy was pretty much that you don't do it, but that people did it anyway, and as long as it didn't get out of hand, the company usually didn't say very much about it.
Lee apparently put his skills to use, forging a new identity, including a selective service card in the name of Alec J. Hidell. It was the first alias Oswald was known to use. Lee was beginning to construct a secret life. He opened a post office box to receive mail for himself and Hidell.
Lee began to receive publications that he did not want to get at home. They were The Worker, the newspaper of the American Communist Party, The Militant, newspaper of the Socialist Workers' Party. All of this he wanted to receive without his landlords noticing.
Lee was hiding things from his family, too. That Thanksgiving, the Oswald brothers gathered at Robert's house.
Thanksgiving Day, November 22nd, 1962, we are all having a pleasant holiday atmosphere. Everybody's getting along fine. John and Margie and his family have not seen Lee in 9 years. It's been a couple of months since I've seen him. We talked about small things, hunting and fishing type thing. You know, what the families were doing and everything. And Lee didn't seem under any particular strain, no indication of any particular problems.
But behind the facade, Lee was beginning to lose control. He was picking fights at work and at home.
Lee became more and more tense, and he began to hit Marina, something he had never done before. And by the winter, he hit her more and more frequently and harder.
At the same time, Lee's interest in politics was growing. The left-wing papers he was reading embraced the issues that were important to him, such as civil rights and Castro's Cuba. As far back as the Marines, Lee was enamored with Fidel's romantic revolution. He now saw Cuba as the Marxist ideal, and he was highly critical of the administration's policies toward Castro. Yet those who knew him claimed Oswald liked the young president.
He definitely was not an enemy. He was an admirer of President Kennedy. And we raised that question several times.
Personal accounts differ. At a party in February 1963, Oswald was introduced to oil geologist Volkmar Schmidt. The two hunkered down by a window to talk politics.
Lee Harvey Oswald brought up in the conversation with me the fact that he really felt very angry about the support which the Kennedy administration gave to the Bay of Pigs invasion. It turned out that Lee Harvey Oswald really idealized the socialism of Cuba, while he was critical of the socialism in the Soviet Union. And he was just obsessed with his anger towards Kennedy.
Schmidt says he tried to divert Lee's political anger toward a more worthy target. General Edwin Walker was a virulent anti-communist. He had recently been fired by Kennedy for preaching right-wing extremism to his troops.
I mentioned General Walker, who deserved criticism because he was a racist, a retired general, ultra-right-wing, and who had just a little time before talked to students at the University of Mississippi who then got so agitated that they shot and killed some reporters.
Ole Miss had erupted when James Meredith was enrolled as the first black student. General Walker drove up from Texas to lead the white student revolt. The result was a bloody 15-hour riot, and General Walker was arrested for inciting the violence. But after a week, he was released. He was soon to start a cross-country tour to rally support for the overthrow of Castro.
In hindsight, I probably may have given Lee Harvey Oswald the idea to go after General Walker. I certainly didn't tell him to take the law in his own hand, not at all. He may also have thought of General Walker independently.
Using his alias, Lee had already ordered a .38 pistol through the mail. Now he ordered more firepower, a cheap Italian rifle. He apparently went on a reconnaissance mission to General Walker's house and scouted the alley in the back.
Oswald had an entire book of operations for his Walker action, including photographs of Walker's house, photographs of an area that he intended to stash the rifle, maps that he had drawn very carefully, statements of political purpose. In the end, he wanted this to be an important historical feat, and this was to be the documentation left behind. He viewed General Walker as an up-and-coming Adolf Hitler, and that he would be the hero who stopped him on his rise to power.
Lee's guns finally arrived in the mail. A few days later, he surprised Marina while she was hanging up the laundry in the backyard.
Dressed all in black. He was carrying his rifle, had his pistol at his waist, and she burst out laughing and asked him what on earth he was doing in that costume, and he told her she was to take a picture of him.
The backyard photographs remain among the most incriminating and controversial evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald.
Oswald himself, shown those photographs, denied that he owned a rifle and denied that this was him in it. He said his head was pasted on it. The critics of the Warren Commission seized on this.
The most famous critic is filmmaker Oliver Stone.
Oswald was no angel, that's clear. But who was he? I'm lost, boss.
Stone's movie suggests the photographs were faked in order to frame Oswald.
He was not a real defector. That he was an intelligence agent on some kind of mission for our government and remained one until the day he died.
The intelligence community murdered their own commander-in-chief.
I never could figure out why this guy orders a traceable weapon to this post office box when he can go into any store in Texas, give a phony name, and walk out with a rifle which can never be traced.
To frame him, obviously.
There's a lot of smoke there, but there's some fire.
We're talking about our government.
No, we're talking about a crime, Bill, pure and simple. Y'all got to start thinking on a different level, like the CIA does. Now, we're through the looking glass here, people. White is black, and black is white. Just maybe Oswald is exactly what he said he was. A patsy.
We took very seriously these charges. We had first the evidence examined by the Warren Commission. Marina testifies that she took it. She identifies the camera that she used. The FBI was able to the exclusion of all other cameras, tie that camera to these photographs. Assuming that all that's fake, we went further with a photographic panel and studied very carefully all of the testimony about the shadows being inappropriate. Our photographic panel indicated in great detail that these shadows were not inappropriate, that the critics had simply not understood optics accordingly.
Oswald gave a copy of the photograph to his friend George de Mohrenschildt. On the back, someone wrote, "Hunter of Fascist," in Russian, and Oswald signed it. The House Committee's experts concluded beyond a doubt the signature was his.
Any notion that the photograph was faked by other people to frame Lee Harvey Oswald now has to explain the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald himself signed that photograph.
On April 6th, Lee was fired from his job at the photo lab. No one knows where he spent his days. Marina says he spent a few evenings shooting target practice. On the night of April 10th, she says, he didn't come home at all.
She waited until 7, and then she made herself a little supper. At about 10, he still hadn't come home. She was worried. She walked into a room, his study, which he told her never to enter. And there, on his desk, she saw a sheet of paper with a key lying on top of it.
Lee wrote to Marina in Russian.
Here is the key to the post office box. You can throw out my clothing, but as for my personal papers, I prefer you keep them. I left you as much money as I could.
He then explained where to find the jail. And she had no idea what he'd gone to do, and she started to shake all over.
That evening, someone fired a single shot through the window of General Walker's study.
Looking the situation over, back there 40 steps behind me is
General Walker survived to tell what happened.
a bullet crashed through the window and just missed me. And it felt much grit and dirt in my hair, and my arm was laying on the desk, and it was bleeding in 3 places, which turned out to be fragments from the shell casing.
Walker's neighbor, Case Coleman, remembers the shot he heard as a 14-year-old youngster.
I was in the den working on a school project with my godfather, and he was helping me out with a typewriter, and we heard this loud bang. I ran out this door here and ran up to the fence. At the time, the church had built a 6-foot stockade fence, but my kid sister's bicycle was sitting here. So I jumped up on the bicycle looking over the fence. That's when I noticed the black Ford that had been backed in here driving out down the alley. There was a 58 Chevy sitting over here with a guy bent over the back seat throwing something on the floorboard, and he went down towards Tull Creek. I can see it now, looking at the 58 Chevy sitting down there. It's very vivid, very vivid.
Based on his account, the Dallas police began looking for several suspects, which would suggest a conspiracy. But Marina says Lee told her a very different story.
Later that night, about 11:30, Lee came in, white, covered with sweat, and looking quite wild in the eyes, and he said, "I shot Walker." Lee explained to Marina that he had jumped on a bus, buried the rifle, and then he'd taken another bus. And he said when he took the bus, there they lose the scent. The radio broadcast that a boy on the spot had seen one or two cars in the alleyway behind Walker's house. Lee laughed. He exploded in laughter. And he said, "Americans are so spoiled. They think you always have to have a car, whereas I got away on my own 2 feet."
The Walker case would not be resolved until after the assassination, when Marina told her story and the Walker bullet was linked to Oswald's ammunition. No co-conspirators were ever identified. Two weeks later, Oswald abruptly left town. In 7 months, he would write into the history books. But for now, he was headed home, to New Orleans.
Who was Lee Harvey Oswald will continue after a short break.
The rights of every man are diminished.
He embodied the spirit, the hopes, and the dreams of an entire nation.
The new frontier is here.
Remember him through his words.
Ask not what your country can do.
Remember him through the images and music of another time.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
The Kennedy years, in words and music.
Wednesday at 7:30.
We are a people haunted by an unfinished life. The young man we never knew. The family man we only glimpsed. The private man we rarely heard.
I don't run for the office of the presidency, saying that life in the 60s will be easy, because I don't think it will be. I think it will be a very dangerous time for us all.
John F. Kennedy, in extraordinary depth, in his own words.
Tune in to Iowa Public Television Wednesday at 8.
It doesn't stop when you graduate or reach a certain age. We are all of us learning even now. You see something unexpected, and you let it take you to a new place. It's not important to understand fully, but just to see. Some call it education, but that's only a word. You see something in a person's face, you hear their story, and that teaches you all that they struggle to learn. Maybe you're just remembering something you knew all along, but forgot. It could be we're here solely to remind each other what must not be missed or ignored, but celebrated and finally known. When do we stop learning? Maybe never.
In Chinese medicine, that
Iowa Public Television, a resource for Iowa's future.
In April 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald returned to New Orleans. In a city that seethed with intrigue and paranoia, he was about to enter the most mysterious chapter of his short life. And the murky trail he left behind still defies a complete explanation.
How many people know who the person depicted on the screen behind me is? Who is it?
At Southeastern Louisiana University, Professor Michael Kurtz teaches a course on the Kennedy assassination.
Depicted here, Lee Harvey Oswald.
His students explore the maze of confusing and sinister political connections that Oswald entered in New Orleans.
There are still unresolved questions about this man, Oswald. Was he a lone assassin, as the Warren Commission claimed? Was he a person who was part of a broader conspiracy, as many people claimed? Or was he simply a patsy set up to take the blame while the real people got away with it, as he himself claimed?
If there was a plot to kill President Kennedy, then it was probably hatched in New Orleans. It was here that Lee Oswald may have crossed paths with men that hated Kennedy and wanted him eliminated.
The crucial question in 1963 is the crucial question in 1993. Was there a conspiracy? Anybody who's going to make a conspiratorial interpretation of the assassination must connect Lee Harvey Oswald to that group that they posit as these co-conspirators. If you want to posit conspiracy, you must show associations. And unfortunately, for a simple explanation, the associations cut in two directions. This is ambivalence, ambivalence, ambivalence.
If we knew more about this case, particularly the background of Lee Harvey Oswald, focusing on the 5 months he spent in New Orleans during the spring and summer 1963, I think that perhaps we could unravel the key to the mystery of the Kennedy assassination that remains as much a mystery today as it did at the time.
Oswald arrived in New Orleans alone. He had left his family behind in Texas with a friend. He soon found work as a maintenance man by hiding much about his past from his new employers at the Riley Coffee Company.
He said that he would call when he got a job. And he did, in fact, call in early May and talked to Marina, said he'd gotten a job, that he had a place for them to stay. Marina was elated, very happy as she hung up the phone and picked up Junie and said, "Papa nas lubit, Father loves us." And then we loaded up the car the next day and drove to New Orleans.
By now, Oswald had found an apartment on Magazine Street.
It looked all right and had some old antique kind of furniture in it, and that part was kind of nice, but by evening it was very clear that it was also terribly infested with cockroaches. When they first went into the apartment, he really wanted her to be pleased, and she wasn't that pleased, and I felt his hurt in that.
At the coffee company, Oswald soon grew bored with his menial job.
Oswald hated his job as a machine greaser at the Riley Coffee Company, and every opportunity he had, he would go next door to Adrian Alba's garage. Alba had an interest that Oswald had, and that was in guns. Alba had National Rifle Association, Argosy, Nature and Hunting, different magazines that Oswald would sit and read. And in addition, Oswald tried to buy a .30-06 rifle from him. Another time he tried to buy a Japanese rifle. This was the bond they had.
Oswald had always liked guns, but Marxist politics were still his ruling passion.
No, sir, I'm not a communist, and I think that
In New Orleans, Oswald became a very visible spokesman for his ideals.
And are you a Marxist? Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
Oswald's political hero was still Fidel Castro.
Well, of course, Americans in general have only begun to notice Cuba since the Cuban Revolution. I always felt that Castro's Cuba was being pushed into this, to the Soviet bloc by American policy. I still feel that way.
Oswald had no sympathy for the hundreds of thousands of exiles who had fled Castro's Cuba.
There are peasants who do not like the collectivization in Cuban agriculture. They flee. They flee Cuba in boats. They flee any way they can go. And I think that the opinion and the attitude of the Cuban government to this is good riddance.
Oswald's unyielding support of Castro was unlikely to win him friends among the Cuban exiles then pouring into New Orleans. Many joined violent paramilitary groups and waged a covert war on Cuba with the support of the CIA and the White House.
I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana.
But after the Bay of Pigs fiasco and the Cuban Missile Crisis, the exiles felt betrayed when Kennedy's support for their war began to wane. By 1963, the Cuban enclaves in New Orleans burned with hatred for the president.
It was an intriguing city at the time, and there was all these things going on with anti-Cuba, pro-Castro elements at the time.
New Orleans homicide detective L.J. Delsa was also an investigator for the House Assassinations Committee.
It was like watching a Humphrey Bogart movie at the time, sort of like a Casablanca, you know.
In the spring of 1963, Lee Oswald entered this world of plot and counterplot. That May, he wrote to America's leading pro-Castro group, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, offering to start a chapter in New Orleans. The committee discouraged him, but he ignored their advice. He began printing his own pro-Castro leaflets and phony membership cards. He asked Marina to help him disguise the fact that he was the only member of his organization.
One day, he asked her to sign a card for an organization. And she said, "You mean that organization with only one member?" And he said, didn't matter how many members it was, it needed 2 signatures. It would seem as though there were more members. And he told her she was to sign under the name A.J. Heidel. And then she asked him, "What's that name? An altered Fidel?" And he told her to shut up.
Oswald began handing out leaflets on the streets of New Orleans. He continued to exaggerate the size of his one-man chapter.
We have had members in this area for several months now. We have decided to feel out the public what they think of our organization, our aims, and for that purpose we have been distributing literature on the street.
Oswald's pro-Castro activities seemed genuine enough, but what happened next is a puzzle. In August, he approached the leader of an anti-Castro group named Carlos Bringuer.
When Oswald came to my store for the first time, he was explaining how he was against Castro, and he was asking in what way he could help us to fight against Castro. He was telling me that he had been in the Marine Corps, that he had experience in guerrilla warfare, and that he can help us in the guerrilla fight against Castro. The second time that Oswald came to my store was when he brought this guidebook from Marines. He said that this was a present for me to see if this could help me out to fight Castro.
The manual showed how to make bombs, booby traps, and how to conduct sabotage operations. Shortly before he sought out Bringuer, Oswald had written to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, claiming that one of his street demonstrations had been attacked by some Cuban exile gusanos. In fact, no such incident had occurred. But it did a few days later, when Carlos Bringuer found someone handing out pro-Castro leaflets on Canal Street.
It was the same Oswald that has been in my store a few days before, offering his service to fight against Castro. And now he was with the sign Viva Fidel and Hands Off Cuba. When he recognized me, he smiled at me, and he even tried to shake hands with me. I refused to shake hands with him, and I started insulting him and cursing him in English.
Police were called to the scene where an amateur movie maker filmed the angry Cubans as they surrounded Oswald.
At that time, I get angry, and I was approaching Oswald trying to punch him in the face. When he saw that I was approaching and he sensed my intention, he put his arm down and he said to me, "Okay, Carlos, if you want to hit me, hit me." Immediately, I realized that he wanted to appear as a victim, as a martyr.
When one of the Cubans took the pro-Castro leaflets and threw them on the ground, the police arrested Oswald and 8 Cubans for disturbing the peace. At the police station, Oswald's conduct became even more mysterious.
We advised him that the booking procedure, which was a municipal misdemeanor,
that he was eligible for posting a bond of $25 in cash or getting a politician to parole him. He said he did not want either. He wanted to go to jail. We also told him that part of the booking procedure would to be that he would have to be photographed and fingerprinted, which he agreed to. He insisted almost that we fingerprint and photograph him. He seemed to want to let everyone know who he was and what he was doing. He could have avoided it very, very simply by saying, hey, here's my $25, let me go home.
What kind of double game was Oswald playing? One piece of evidence has continued to raise important questions about Oswald's true attitude toward Cuba and whose side he was really on.
The leaflets that Oswald hands out on Canal Street is pro-Castro leaflets, hands off Cuba, telling the government to leave it alone, let it stay communist, let Castro alone. And the return addresses that are stamped on it is 544 Camp Street.
In that same building, there is a private detective agency by a man named Guy Bannister. And Guy Bannister is certainly not pro-Castro. He's an ex-FBI agent from New York who is a violently anti-Castro and working to overthrow Castro.
But according to one of Bannister's secretaries, Delphine Roberts, Lee Oswald worked with Guy Bannister in 1963 and was given an office in the Camp Street building to mount his pro-Castro campaign.
It's when the news accounts from Dallas were showing Oswald that Delphine said to me, well, you know, he was in this office, you saw him. And I told her that not to my knowledge. I didn't know that I'd seen him. To me, he would have been just another face in the crowd. And she was just calling my attention to the news in Dallas that this man had been in our office.
Joe Newborough is a private detective who worked with Guy Bannister.
The new building over here is where 544 Camp Street was. This was Bannister's office. This was Mancusa's restaurant. This is 544 Camp Street. And this window here is where Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly had an office.
Newborough thinks the Camp Street address on Oswald's leaflet proves nothing because Bannister's office was on Lafayette Street, around the corner.
Absolutely, you could not find yourself in Bannister's office if you went through the entrance at 544 Camp. It went strictly to the second floor of the building. There was no stairwell down. You had to exit the second floor to the sidewalk, walk around the corner, and go into Bannister's office.
So that's separate entrances?
Totally separate entrances, and probably 60 steps apart.
But new witnesses to an Oswald Bannister connection continue to come forward, including Professor Michael Kurtz.
Yes, I saw them once in the Mancuso's restaurant on the ground floor of the infamous 544 Camp Street building. This is sometime during the summer of 1963. I went across the street to get a cup of coffee, and which I did, and there were Bannister and Oswald sitting together at a table chatting with each other. It was strange company for the Lee Harvey Oswald portrayed by the Warren Commission as a Marxist, a Leninist, a pro-Castro individual to be seen in the company of an extreme right-wing individual like Guy Bannister.
Guy Bannister was actively involved in the secret training of Cuban exiles. One of Bannister's comrades in the fight against Castro was a former airline pilot named David Ferry.
He was a brilliant flyer. He'd flown in and out of Cuba before and after the Bay of Pigs, taking guerrillas in, extracting them after operations. He was heard to say sometime after the Bay of Pigs that President Kennedy had betrayed the nation in his conduct of that operation. And he said on one occasion that the president ought to be shot. And later, some people would come to think that he meant it.
In the 1950s, David Ferry commanded a squadron in the Civil Air Patrol, but was suspended for indoctrinating the young cadets with his anti-communist views. In the 50s, Lee Oswald was in the CAP, and several fellow cadets said David Ferry was one of Oswald's instructors.
There are some clues to suggest that Oswald and Ferry's paths crossed again in the summer of 1963. Most persuasive of all, perhaps, were the group of people, completely independent witnesses, who said that a car arrived one day in the little town of Clinton outside New Orleans, and that 3 white men were in it. One of them was Oswald, who most oddly got out of the car, the only white face to line up in a long line of blacks waiting to register to vote, waited, stood in the line, and then eventually departed. And they said that one of the other 2 white men, one of Oswald's companions, was in fact a man who looked exactly like David Ferry. And they had no doubt later about their recognition of Ferry, because Ferry by that time looked pretty odd. He suffered from alopecia, and he wore a wig and indeed false eyebrows, not the sort of guy you forget in a hurry.
If David Ferry was with Oswald in 1963, it could be significant because Ferry, as well as Guy Bannister, was connected to one of the major figures in organized crime.
We took very seriously the possibility that organized crime had a hand in the president's death. The FBI had illegal electronic surveillance on the major figures of organized crime. We did a survey of that surveillance. What we did find, and shockingly, is repeated conversations by these people that indicated the depth of their hatred for Kennedy, and actual discussions of he ought to be killed, or he ought to be whacked.
No mobster hated the Kennedys more than Carlos Marcello, the mafia chieftain of New Orleans, a prime target of the administration's war on organized crime. In 1961, Robert Kennedy had personally ordered Marcello's arrest and deportation. The boss of New Orleans was humiliated.
Carlos Marcello talks about he speaks in Sicilian, getting the stone out of my shoe, and talking about getting a nut to kill not Bobby Kennedy, who was his nemesis, but John Kennedy, who was the man behind the nemesis.
Marcello returned to New Orleans to fight the deportation order. His attorneys hired both Guy Bannister and David Ferry as investigators in the case. For Robert Blakey, who believes the mafia was involved in the Kennedy assassination, this is the critical link.
When you find David Ferry, who is an investigator for Carlos Marcello, being a boyhood friend to Lee Harvey Oswald, and with him that summer, and with Carlos Marcello at that very point in time, you have an immediate connection between a man who had the motive, opportunity, and means to kill Kennedy, and the man who killed Kennedy.
I think what many conspiracy critics do is they try to take the chain, the connections, too far back. They say Oswald knew Ferry, and Ferry did some investigative work for Marcello, and Bannister did some investigative work for Marcello. Marcello hated Kennedy, and therefore it must have been Marcello deciding to kill Kennedy, down to Ferry and Bannister, who then gave the order to Oswald, who went off and did it. It's wonderful speculation. There's just no evidence to back it up.
Gerald Posner disputes all the sightings of Oswald and Ferry in the Civil Air Patrol and in 1963. He points out there has never been any hard documentary evidence linking the 2 men.
I discovered documents that were from the Civil Air Patrol, which show that David Ferry was suspended from the CAP in 1954 and not reinstated until 1958. He wasn't even in the patrol in 1955 when Oswald was a member.
Frontline has uncovered the first hard evidence that places Oswald and Ferry together. This photograph taken in 1955 at a CAP barbecue. John Cirivolo and Tony Eisenhower were in the CAP with Lee Oswald.
This is several cadets, including Oswald on the end in the white T-shirt, myself standing in front of him, and over here in the white T-shirt and the helmet is Dave Ferry.
Because of all of the publicity, you can recognize Ferry, you can recognize Oswald. They were both in the CAP at the same time. They were both wearing CAP uniforms.
After the Kennedy assassination, David Ferry denied that he ever knew Lee Oswald.
I never heard David Ferry mention Lee Harvey Oswald. I never met him. I would certainly remember if I ever did.
Leighton Martins was also a CAP cadet. He stayed friendly with Ferry until his death in 1967.
And it does appear as though David Ferry is in the picture, and on the other end of the picture there is a person who looks like Lee Harvey Oswald. It would indicate that there could be a possibility of an association, but if and to what extent, it's another question. Of course, we've all been photographed with people, and we could be presented with photographs later and asked, well, do you know this person? Obviously you must, because you were photographed with them, to which we'd have to answer, well, no, it's just a photograph, and I don't know that person. It's just someone who happened to be in the picture. So, but it's interesting.
The shame of this thing is that the whole question of Oswald's activity in New Orleans was never properly investigated by officialdom at the beginning. Guy Bannister, the former FBI agent at 544 Camp Street, was never, ever asked by anybody about Lee Harvey Oswald. David Ferry was questioned, but the investigation was dropped very quickly, and the names of neither Bannister nor Ferry are in the Warren report. Simply doesn't mention either of them.
If Oswald did have a secret connection to Ferry and Bannister in 1963, the nature of that relationship remains unclear. And that evidence must be weighed against the rest of what is known of his time in New Orleans, where Oswald continued to demonstrate for Castro.
Well, I think if we take Oswald at the simplest level, what we see he's trying to do is enhance his credentials as a supporter of Castro. One of the ways he's trying to do this is actually work for Castro. Another way, he's trying to find out information that would be of use to Castro, and the normal way you find out information is you join the enemy.
That summer, Oswald wrote an account of his political activity in New Orleans, stressing his credentials as a Marxist, street agitator, and an organizer. In this resume, he wrote that he had infiltrated Carlos Bringuer's organization. When Oswald and the Cubans appeared in court for disturbing the peace over the leafleting incident, Bringuer was determined to find out more about the young American.
A friend of mine went to Oswald's house, and he was telling Oswald that he was for Castro. Then they start talking over there, and in the meantime, Oswald Child came out, and Marina came after that, and they start talking in Russian. That is when we learned that Oswald was speaking Russian. My friend asked Oswald if that was Russian, where he had learned Russian. Oswald's answer was that he was attending Tulane University, taking Russian studies.
A lie.
And that is a lie. He was a liar. He lied a lot in his life.
These are officials of INCA, the Information Council of the Americas.
Oswald, who had concealed his defection to Russia, was earning the attention of professional anti-communists.
Ed Butler, who conceived and initiated the organization. As executive vice president, he is in charge of the INCA program and engages in direct personal conflict with communism.
When Ed Butler and Carlos Bringuer were invited to debate Oswald on a local radio show, Butler did some background research.
We found out after I had accepted the interview about Oswald's defection to Russia. The information came from the House Un-American Activities Committee files. They sent me the material, I requested it, and they sent it.
Where did they get it from?
They got it from the newspapers, the open press. That's basically what they sent me, clippings that Oswald had defected to Russia and so forth.
Butler and Bringuer met Oswald at the studios of WDSU Radio.
Before the debate, we were talking over there for about 15 minutes. And as he saw my guidebook, the guidebook for Marine that he had left for me, he said to me, Carlos, please don't use that guidebook because it's obsolete. You're going to get killed.
And now back to conversation carte blanche. Here again, Bill Slatter.
Mr. Oswald, as you might imagine, is on the hot seat tonight, and I believe...
After the assassination, the debate was reenacted on film, using the original sound recording of Oswald's voice.
Are you or have you been a communist?
Well, I had answered that prior.
Oswald seemed unaware that his opponents knew all about his defection to Russia. He was about to be ambushed.
Mr. Butler, about some newspaper clippings to my attention. You did live in Russia for 3 years?
That is correct, and I think the fact that I did live for a time in the Soviet Union gives me excellent qualifications to repudiate charges that Cuba and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is communist controlled.
I think he was surprised, but again, he handled it, if you listen to the debate, very coolly, and it impeached his credibility. And yet he managed to turn it to his advantage, which is, I think, shows some aplomb, certainly a lot more than most people give him credit for.
I would like to know, is it Fair Play for Cuba Committee or Fair Play for Russia Committee?
Well, that is, of course, very provocative and question. I don't think it requires an answer.
Oh, I see. Well, would you say then that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee is not a communist-run organization?
We have been investigated from several points of view. That is, points of view of taxes, allegiance, aversion, and so forth. The findings have been, as I say, absolutely zero.
He was angry that it has been discovered that he had tried to defect to the Soviet Union, and he had been exposed in the debate. And that I could still see his face becoming red and redder and redder.
Gentlemen, I'm going to have to interrupt. Our time is almost up. Thank you very much, and good evening.
The last thing that I remember was Oswald taking out a notebook, glancing up at me and fixing me with a gaze of hatred and asking for my name and address and phone number and writing it down in the notebook, snapping it shut, looking up, and giving me that Oswald sneer. I went one way and he went the other.
You either are a communist or have been. Could you straighten out that point?
The debate ended Oswald's campaign for Castro on the streets of New Orleans,
Prior to this program,
and he withdrew from the public stage.
yes, I am a Marxist.
Mr. Butler, about some newspaper...
By now, he had been fired from the Riley Coffee Company, the third job he'd lost in a year, and he began spending even more time at his local library. That summer, he checked out books about the assassination of Huey Long, Mao Zedong's revolution, and John F. Kennedy. Oswald still disagreed with Kennedy on Cuba, but he seemed to like the president.
But insofar as he spoke about Kennedy, it was to praise him, and he suffered, as she did, in the summer of 1963 over the death of the Kennedy's baby. Both he and Marina took this very personally, and they thought that if the best doctors couldn't save the Kennedy's baby, then the baby they were expecting might not be born alive either. One evening, Marina came home about dusk, and she saw Lee on the screened-in porch, and he was perched on his knee with his rifle at his shoulder, and he was aiming it. She was extremely surprised at this. She hated to see him with the rifle again, but he continued to dry fire the rifle for the last part of August and the first part of September.
Marina says Lee told her he wanted to go fight for Castro, and he began hatching a scheme to hijack a plane to Havana.
He said that he would sit in the front row of the airplane cabin. She would sit in the back row with June, and at a certain point, he would put a gun in the back of the pilot of the aircraft. She would stand up and keep the entire passenger contingent at bay with a pistol and speak to them, and she would speak to the crowd and tell them to be quiet. Marina laughed at him and said, well, but I don't speak English. How am I going to explain to them? Eventually, she laughed him out of the skyjacking plan, and he came home one day and said, Mama, I found a legal way. Go to Mexico.
On September 25th, Oswald disappeared from New Orleans. Where he was that night is still one of the intriguing mysteries of his life. There is testimony that sometime between 7 and 10 p.m., he made a call to a leader of the Socialist Labor Party in Houston. The Warren Commission believed Oswald took a bus from New Orleans to Houston, but there are no records to confirm that conclusion. Meanwhile, more than 200 miles away in Dallas, 3 men, 2 Latins and an American, showed up unexpectedly at the doorstep of 3 young Cuban exiles whose father headed an anti-Castro organization. Sylvia and Annie Odio granted Frontline this rare interview.
One night I opened the door for 3 men that came to see one of my sisters. I opened the door. They were in a small hallway with bright lights overhead. The taller man introduced the other 2 men. Leopoldo, he said that was his name. He introduced the American who was in the middle as Leon Oswald, and he introduced the one that seemed Mexican and spoke with a Mexican accent as Angelo.
And are you quite clear about it, that when those men visited your apartment, the American was introduced as Oswald?
The American was introduced as Leon Oswald. That would always be in my mind very clearly.
According to the Odio sisters, Leon Oswald said nothing, as Leopoldo and Angelo asked for help raising money for the anti-Castro cause. Suspicious, the Odio sisters declined, and a half hour later, the 3 men drove away.
And I think it was 2 days after that, Leopoldo, who had clearly a Cuban accent, called me on the phone, and he tried to be very friendly on the phone with me and was trying to sell me the idea of the American. The first thing that he asked was, what did you think of the American? And actually, I had not formed any opinion of the American at the time. He said, well, you know, he is, we don't know what to make of him. He's kind of loco. He's been telling us the Cubans should have murdered or should have assassinated President Kennedy right after the Bay of Pigs, and they didn't have any guts to do it. They should do it. And it was a very easy thing to do at the time.
But author Gerald Posner believes Sylvia Odio is mistaken about the date on which the 3 men appeared at her door.
It's physically impossible for Lee Harvey Oswald to have been at the Odio residence on the days that she describes. She says that he was either there on the 26th or 27th of September, a Thursday or Friday, maybe at the very earliest, Wednesday the 25th.
The reason that I remember so clearly was because that same night, or I think either that night or the night afterwards, I wrote my father. And I also told a friend of mine who was my father confessor about the visit.
Odio talked to Father Walter McCann after the phone call from Leopoldo.
I think I can pin a date to this conversation with Sylvia. It was the day in which I spoke to her about her attending a charity event at which Janet Leigh was going to appear in Dallas.
If Father McCann is correct about Janet Leigh, then the 3 men must have visited the Odios 2 days earlier on September 25th, the only night Oswald could possibly have been in Dallas.
They were trying to sell me the American because they spoke that he was a marksman, that he had been an ex-Marine, and that he was someone who could be used and who could be an asset to any organization.
Leopoldo and Angelo have never been identified, and the meaning of this incident remains elusive. If Oswald was there, was he infiltrating another anti-Castro group, or was someone setting him up to take the blame for the Kennedy assassination? Lee Oswald is next seen the following day, alone on a bus heading south from Houston to Mexico City. On the bus were 2 young Australian women.
It was on the bus to Mexico City that we encountered Lee Oswald. He heard us speaking English and wanted to talk to us. And so we talked about our travels, and he told us that he'd been to Russia. He went then and got his passport and showed us the Russian stamp on his passport.
In Mexico City, as he had in Helsinki 4 years earlier, Oswald would try to engineer another defection. Not far from the bus station, he checked into the Hotel Comercio. He took a cheap room on the 4th floor. He had brought with him a file on his pro-Castro activity in New Orleans. It contained letters from the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, newspaper articles, his handwritten biography, and the pamphlets and phony membership cards he had printed. The day he arrived in Mexico City, Oswald left the hotel and made his way to the Cuban consulate, where he was met by a Mexican employee named Sylvia Duran.
Well, it was near lunch hour, and he came and he asked for an application for going to Cuba. But I remember that he was traveling with all his papers that demonstrate that he was a friend of the Cuban Revolution. And he showed me his card belonging to the Fair Play for Cuba.
Duran told Oswald he could get into Cuba only on a temporary visa, and only if he were in transit to Russia. So Oswald walked 2 blocks to the Soviet diplomatic compound. That summer, the Oswalds had been trying to be readmitted to the Soviet Union. Lee planned to travel through Cuba and then meet Marina in Russia. At the Soviet embassy, he met with 3 consular officials. They were, in fact, all KGB officers. In their first interview, they claimed it was just happenstance that they were present when Oswald showed up.
We all thought the man had an unstable nervous system. He was extremely agitated.
During our talk, Oswald kept feeling in his pockets, taking out all sorts of papers. Then he took out a gun and put it in front of him. I sat opposite him. I took the gun away and put it on Pavel's desk. Pavel Antonovich asked him, "Why did you come here with a gun? What do you need a gun for?" He said, "I'm afraid of the FBI. I'm being persecuted. I need a gun to protect myself, for my personal safety." That's what he said.
Oswald was told it would take several months to get a Soviet visa, but without one, he would be unable to go to Cuba. Oswald took the news badly.
Well, then I explained, and then he got in that moment, he couldn't believe what I was saying, and he said, "But that's impossible. I have to go to Cuba right now because I only have a permission of 3 or 4 days in Mexico City, so I have to go." I thought that in a moment he will be crying because his eyes, he was very excited, he was very red, and his eyes is like with bright, shining, like he was in tears. So. And he didn't want to understand. And so I called the Consul Asque.
Duran says Oswald lost his temper with Consul Asque.
Then Asque says, "Listen, get out. Get out." And he went to the door that it was locked. He opened and he said, "Get out. And if I see you again, if you come again, I'm going to kick you out."
As Oswald left the Cuban and Soviet embassies, he was being watched. These photographs taken by Cuban intelligence show the CIA operatives at work. From a house across the road from the Cuban consulate, the CIA maintained a continuous photographic surveillance. Here, a telephoto lens can be seen poking through the blinds.
It's my recollection that at the time of Oswald's presence in Mexico City, there was something wrong with some of the cameras that we were using. We were trying to fix it. But the fact remains that there are no photographs of Lee Harvey Oswald taken while he was in Mexico City at that time, and I can't explain 100% why not.
But the recently declassified report on Oswald's Mexico City trip, written by the House Assassinations Committee, tells a different story.
And we now find that there were several former CIA officers who said that there had been such a photograph. One of them said that he'd seen it and described it in detail, a profile shot of Oswald at the gate, another one taken from behind as he went in.
And the CIA station chief in Mexico City, the late Win Scott, in his recently declassified memoirs, also said the CIA took pictures of Oswald.
Persons watching these embassies photographed Oswald as he entered and left and clocked the time spent on each visit.
That's fine for Win Scott to say, but he has no evidence to demonstrate it. And he couldn't produce the photograph, so what is he talking about?
CIA wiretaps and bugs also recorded several of Oswald's conversations inside the embassies. The CIA has always maintained those tapes were routinely erased before the Kennedy assassination.
Just done in the normal course of business, that after the tapes had been transcribed and the material was put on paper, then the tapes were routinely erased and used again.
But again, this claim is contradicted. A high-ranking CIA officer in the Mexico City embassy told Frontline the Oswald tapes existed months after the assassination, when they were played for 2 Warren Commission lawyers.
My best recollection is they offered to us to listen. They said to us, it was Win Scott, that would you like to listen to the tapes of this particular one? I can't remember now whether it was a wiretap or a bug. And Bill and I thought about it a minute and said, well, what do they like? And so they played a little bit of it for us.
Slauson says the tape was of poor quality and difficult to understand. He could not identify Oswald's voice.
Now, there were many bugs and many wiretaps. So it could be that the one that we were offered to the opportunity to listen to was the only one that hadn't been destroyed. Now, even that, just one not having been destroyed, would show that Mr. Helms' statement was incorrect.
Where then are the tapes? And the question that arises here is, why is the CIA reluctant for us to see the photographs and reluctant for us to see the tapes, to hear the tapes of Oswald's voice? While they refuse to come clean, clearly there's going to be a suspicion that the tapes or the photographs don't show what one would expect them to.
The CIA did release a photograph to the FBI on the day Kennedy was shot. They said it was Oswald entering the Soviet embassy. The agency soon realized its mistake, but the absence of photos of Oswald has fueled speculation.
The suspicion was that Oswald didn't make it at all, that there was an imposter attempting to frame him in Mexico City. Had that been established, it would indicate a sophisticated effort to frame Oswald, which would immediately draw attention to American intelligence.
But there is much evidence that the real Oswald was in Mexico City. At the Soviet embassy, all 3 KGB officers told Frontline the man they met was the real Lee Harvey Oswald, not the man in the photograph the CIA released.
Нет, это совершенно другой человек. No, this is a completely different person. The Oswald who had visited our embassy and whose photographs I saw in many newspapers and on TV was completely different.
The day after the assassination, in the Mexican newspapers were a photo of Oswald. And I said to my husband, I'm sure that this is the man who went to ask for a visa. So I went to the embassy and I looked up the applications and I saw his application and it was the same one.
We obtained from the Cuban officials the visa application with his photograph on it and his signature. We verified that it was Oswald's signature. Oswald, therefore, was in Mexico City.
and records at the Hotel Comercio show the real Oswald was here, too. The handwriting on the register is his. Oswald stayed in Mexico City 4 days. But in the end, both the Russians and the Cubans rejected him. All his plans to fight for Castro and return to Russia had come to nothing. He had nowhere to go but back to America. In the early hours of an October morning, Oswald boarded a bus heading north. A fellow passenger remembers him, sitting alone.
Mostly, he just leaned against the window, quiet, thoughtful, didn't speak to anyone. To me, he seemed obsessed, fixated on one idea.
On October 2nd, Oswald crossed the U.S. border, bound for Dallas.
Who was Lee Harvey Oswald will continue after a short break.
In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In 1498, he sailed again the deep blue sea. In 1492, Columbus sailed the
Welcome to a place that is always just beginning. That rouses itself day to day and year to year to admire what it's made, starting with nothing, then rushes to invent itself all over again. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things, knowing what goes on now goes on to shape tomorrow. Welcome to a land that is never exactly what you think it is, and will never stay that way for long. There are a million stories in the streets of the cities we never finish building. We intend to tell them all.
Hi, I'm Mark Russell, and we'll be kicking off our 19th season of comedy specials on public television from our spectacular state-of-the-art new facility in Buffalo. And for the life of me, I never knew what state-of-the-art meant. But it makes me sound like a hands-on, cutting-edge, push-the-envelope, 90s kind of guy. Even the jokes will be state-of-the-art, inspired for the most part by some of the best politicians money can buy.
Tune in to Iowa Public Television Wednesday at 7.
It's beautiful. It's mysterious. It's the creation of life. It's everything you ever wanted to know, but were afraid to ask your biology teacher. Curious? Of course you are. That's the nature of sex.
Coming to Iowa Public Television Monday through Wednesday, November 22nd through 24th.
You are viewing TV worth watching on Iowa Public Television, a resource for Iowa's future.
On October 3rd, 1963, just 7 weeks before President Kennedy's planned visit to Texas, Lee Harvey Oswald returned to Dallas. With no place to call his own, he took a room at the YMCA. He had no job and no means to support his family. His wife Marina and his daughter June were living with their friend Ruth Payne in Irving, a Dallas suburb. Marina was expecting their second child.
Soon after Lee came back to Texas, it was perhaps a week later, I was having coffee with Marina at a neighbor's house, and we were talking about the fact that Lee hadn't been able to get a job. He was looking for work and needed work. And another neighbor there said that her brother worked at the Texas School Book Depository, and she thought that they were still hiring people. So I called the School Book Depository to see whether there might be an opening there.
There was an opening, and Oswald was hired as a warehouse clerk to fill orders for textbooks. The job paid only $1.25 an hour, but Lee liked the idea he would be working with books.
He came out each weekend. He and Marina did argue a good bit, and I was somewhat impatient with him. She was saying, you see, he doesn't love me. And all the time I knew her, she was worried about whether he loved her or not.
Well, he came out on weekends. I remember stepping over him one time as he was watching TV, watching the football game, his chin in his hands there, and thinking, what a fine little a revolutionary we have here being snookered into the new opiate of the people, football.
Michael Payne and Lee also talked politics on the weekends.
He thought capitalism was rotten. It was a fraud, and it needed to be overthrown. Lee wanted to be an active guerrilla in the effort to bring about a new world order. We discovered we were both interested in the activities of right-wing groups in Dallas, which were common, numerous at that time. And I think he described his activities as spying on them and thought of himself as doing that. In that conversation, the name of General Walker was raised.
Oswald told Payne he had gone to a right-wing rally to hear General Edwin Walker, the same man he had tried to assassinate a few months earlier.
There was no doubt in my mind that he believed violence was the only effective tool. He didn't want to mess around with trying to change the system.
Oswald's return had not gone unnoticed at the FBI field office in Dallas. The CIA had told the FBI of Oswald's trip to Mexico and his visit to the Soviet embassy.
I wanted to find out where Lee Oswald was. I had determined from previous investigation that he was not living at the Payne residence, but he had been seen visiting there. I wanted to find out if he was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and if so, where, and what he was doing.
Oswald was staying at this rooming house in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas. Apparently worried about the FBI, he registered under a new alias, O.H. Lee. And in these final days, many possible Oswald sightings have a sinister cast. At a Lincoln Mercury car dealer's, a man who called himself Oswald and said he'd been to Russia test drove a car at crazy speeds. He bragged about coming into money in 3 weeks. It was 3 weeks before the assassination. The manager of a parking garage says a man calling himself Oswald came looking for a job. He then asked if the roof had a good view of downtown Dallas. President Kennedy's motorcade would pass within a block of the garage. Just days before the assassination, there was another sighting. A man resembling Oswald was seen target practicing. He almost started a fight when he began shooting at other people's targets.
Well, this number 8 target is the target that Oswald was supposedly shot at. One witness has said he helped him sight his scope in and said he was real good, but I don't know.
All of this testimony has to be taken very seriously. All of it has to be taken with an enormous grain of salt. These are people who did not know Oswald and who are subsequently remembering, oh, the guy involved in the assassination is the guy I saw weeks and months ago. This is the least credible testimony unless it can be specifically corroborated.
In fact, most of Oswald's time in Dallas can be accounted for. At the end of his working day, he rode the bus to the rooming house. He spent weekends with his family. There is no hard evidence that he was meeting with any possible co-conspirators, including his mysterious right-wing associates from New Orleans.
When Lee Harvey Oswald returns to Dallas, he certainly has no contact with either Ferry or Bannister in terms of letters, telephone records, or anything else. So if he did know them, it had been in New Orleans, and he had no contact with them when Kennedy was coming to Dallas.
But 2 uncorroborated reports do hint at a continued connection to Cuban exiles. One witness thought she saw Oswald at an anti-Castro gathering shortly before the assassination. Another claims Oswald was in touch with an anti-Castro activist named Pedro Gonzalez. Gonzalez strongly denies the allegation. The story was uncovered by Earl Goles, then a Dallas reporter. His source was Gonzalez's neighbor.
He saw a note that had been left in Mr. Gonzalez's mailbox by a person who signed his name as Lee Oswald, and in an urgent tone left 2 Dallas telephone numbers for Mr. Gonzalez to call.
What date was this?
This would have been about the 17th of November, a Sunday, the one day that no one had seemed to know where Oswald was, either his wife nor the rooming house in Dallas.
That day, Ruth Payne and Marina tried to call Oswald.
And I dialed the number, asked for Lee Oswald, and was told, no, Lee Oswald lives here. And so I checked, is this the number? Yes, it was. And I really hung up in confusion and told Marina what had happened. Then the next day, when Lee called, as he normally did in the evening after work, Marina said we had tried to reach him and that there was no one of that name there. And he bawled her out for trying to reach him. When she hung up, she was very distressed, said that he was using an assumed name and he's done this before and he lives in this fantasy and he has this idea about being a great man. And she was very worried about him, worried about his mental state, as I understood it from her.
On Wednesday evening, 2 days before the assassination, one of the boarders at the rooming house recalls Oswald intently watching a TV news story about President Kennedy's visit to Dallas. That week, Dallas newspapers published more details, including maps of the motorcade route. The White House party would fly into Dallas and drive through the city. The planned route would take the motorcade into Dealey Plaza and right by the Texas School Book Depository. After work on Thursday, Oswald asked a co-worker to give him a lift to Irving.
Thursday, which was the night before the assassination, I came home from grocery shopping and Lee was outside in the yard. I was surprised because it was the only time he came without asking.
And Marina thought he'd come to make up with her after a fight they'd had. He tried to kiss her. She didn't let him. And he said to her that she was getting spoiled, living with Americans. And early that evening, he asked her on 3 separate occasions to join him in Dallas, and if she would, he would get an apartment the next day.
Marina was still angry, and she said no. Sometime that evening, Oswald entered the garage, where he kept his rifle.
I went into the garage, and the light was on, which surprised me, because I knew Marina was pretty careful turning the light out when she went in the garage for anything. And, I hadn't been in the garage, so I assumed that Lee had been in there and forgotten to turn the light out.
Lee woke up early the next morning. Marina was still sleeping. He made his own coffee. Then he kissed his children and told Marina goodbye.
Later, she found what he'd left on the bureau. It was $170, and she thought to herself, that must be everything Lee had. And she found something else. It was Lee's wedding ring, and he left it in a little cup that her grandmother had given her.
When Oswald left the house, he was carrying an oblong package wrapped in brown paper. He told the neighbor who gave him a ride to work that the package contained curtain rods for his room in Oak Cliff. Later that day, a long, empty brown bag would be found on the 6th floor of the book depository. President Kennedy was up early that morning as well. In Fort Worth, the crowds were friendly.
He is years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas.
In Dallas, Oswald's co-workers were eagerly awaiting the motorcade.
We were looking out towards Elm Street. So he walked up and asked us, what is everybody looking for? What is everybody waiting on? So we told him we was waiting on the president to come by. He put his hand in his pocket and laughed and walked away. So I don't know where he went, or if he went upstairs or downstairs or where.
Oswald rode the elevator up to the 6th floor, where he spent the morning filling book orders. In Fort Worth, the president was headed to the airport for the short flight to Dallas. About 12 o'clock, Oswald's co-workers went down to lunch. Oswald shouted for them to send the elevator back up. By now, President Kennedy and his wife had landed at Love Field. The welcome was warm. On the 6th floor of the depository, someone had screened off a corner window with boxes. Oswald's prints would later be found on some of them, including the boxes arranged to support the sniper's rifle. Two witnesses spotted a man with a rifle at the 6th floor window. They assumed he was there to protect the president. Oswald later claimed that at this time he was eating lunch with two fellow workers and had then gone to buy a Coke. But his co-workers denied having lunch with Oswald. Some witnesses thought they saw two men on the 6th floor, evidence, if true, that there was a conspiracy. At 12:23, amateur cameraman Charles Bronson panned across the depository. Frontline had this footage scientifically enhanced to see if a second man could be seen on the 6th floor.
Well, the left window, when you look at a single frame, appears to have a person standing there. You can see the shoulders and perhaps the arms, and some people said that in successive frames, somebody's walking back and forth. But when we processed the image to reduce the grain noise, we found that all of the images throughout the frame look approximately the same. And so in that 6th floor window, that is not anybody walking around, that's grain noise walking around.
And this film, shot by Robert Hughes, shows the motorcade approaching Dealey Plaza. Hughes stops filming for a few seconds and then starts again just as the limousine passes in front of the depository.
On the Hughes film, there are a lot of things to see, and on the 5th floor in particular, we see an employee of the book depository raise his right arm right there as he waves to the motorcade passing just under the building. Now we move to the 6th floor, and we observe in the arched window that is adjacent to the sniper's nest a form that some people have said is human-like in appearance. And when we ran the enhanced film in motion, that human form disappears, and we conclude there is no human form in that window. We do also conclude that there is movement in the 6th floor corner window indicating the presence of a person.
Just 7 seconds before the first shot is fired, something moves in the corner window. In the window below, Harold Norman raises his arm and waves to the president.
We were sitting on the 5th floor, directly on the 6th floor window. And the shots came from above, and there was a gun. The shots were firing, boom, click, click, boom, click, click, boom, click, click. Well, there was 3 shots fired right above us, and we were sitting on the 5th floor.
Frame by frame, the tragedy unfolds in the 21 seconds of 8mm film shot by Abraham Zapruder. As the motorcade rounds the corner, it slows. In the background, a little girl runs beside the limousine. Suddenly, there's a gunshot. Governor Connolly hears it and turns. The little girl stops dead and looks around. 3 seconds later, a second shot. A bullet has passed through the president's throat. It hits Connolly in the back, and he starts falling. Mrs. Kennedy turns to her husband. Something's wrong. She looks into his face. The fatal headshot. The exact number and timing of the shots have been argued over endlessly, but there is a growing consensus that the Zapruder film shows 3 shots were fired in about 8 seconds. Many believe a second gunman fired a 4th shot from the grassy knoll. Immediately after the shooting, many people followed a policeman up the embankment, but when police searched the area, they found no gunman, no gun, no cartridges. But years later, it was discovered that a motorcycle policeman's radio button had been jammed open, and that the gunshots in Dealey Plaza may have been accidentally recorded.
The House Select Committee on Assassinations used sound experts to listen to a Dallas police dictabelt, and they concluded with a 95% certainty that there was a 4th shot fired at Dealey Plaza, and it came from the grassy knoll. The National Academy of Sciences reviewed their work and found a multitude of errors and omissions, the most serious of which was that the time that the Select Committee experts thought the shots were being fired was the wrong time. It was actually 1 minute after the assassination had actually taken place.
And just now we've received reports here at Parkland that...
In the chaos and confusion of that day, many mistakes were made in the autopsy on Kennedy's body. But the medical photographs and x-rays have confirmed that if there was a shot from the grassy knoll, it missed.
There were only 2 shots that struck President Kennedy. Both came from the rear. 4 government investigations all came to the same conclusion. The Warren Commission in the 60s, in 1968, the Clark panel set by Attorney General Ramsey Clark. In the 70s, the Rockefeller Commission, and finally in the late 70s, the House Select Committee, with the largest forensics panel re-examining the evidence.
Modern computer modeling is a technique that was not available to earlier investigators. These 3-dimensional graphics of Dealey Plaza were produced by a specialist company called Failure Analysis Associates on behalf of the American Bar Association. By feeding data into the computer, it is possible to model the trajectory of the so-called magic bullet, the second shot fired from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Critics say that unless it pursued a bizarre zigzag trajectory, it was impossible for one bullet to pass through both men.
4 government commissions all concluded it was a straight line right through the 2 men. There's no question that a single bullet could inflict all 7 wounds on both the president and the governor and emerge in very good condition. As it slowed, as it moved through the 2 men, it moved fast enough to break bone, but not fast enough to deform the bullet. The computer technicians used reverse projection to go from the wounds on Kennedy and Connally and determine where the assassin had to be located to inflict those wounds. And a cone is splayed out from the wound and shows that the only area almost centers on the southeast corner, 6th floor, Texas School Book Depository.
And if the 3 shots were fired in 8 seconds, this is the computer model of the sniper's view. After the 3rd shot, someone saw the sniper slowly withdraw his rifle. Leaving 3 cartridges on the floor, he made his way to the stairs. The rifle, with 1 shell still in the breech, was later found behind some boxes. Oswald was first seen 90 seconds later, standing by the door of the lunchroom, looking calm. A policeman stopped him momentarily, but let him go. Within 3 minutes of the shooting, Oswald walked out the front door. He boarded a bus, but jumped out and hailed a taxi when the bus got stuck in traffic. He asked the taxi to drop him a couple of blocks away from his rooming house in Oak Cliff. Oswald hurried to his room. This is the room for which Oswald said he needed curtain rods. Oswald put a .38 revolver in his waistband, took a light zippered jacket from his closet, and left. His landlady last saw him standing by the bus stop outside the rooming house. By now, the Texas School Book Depository had been sealed off, and police had issued a description of a suspect in the assassination.
A white male, brown hair, approximately 5'6" to 5'8", weighing 160 pounds, had been seen in the window of the depository and was believed to be the shooter.
Gerald Hill helped search the book depository.
It was dirty, it was dusty, it had an old wooden floor, it was an ancient building, it had boxes of books stacked here and there. There was a shield of boxes that were stacked in such a way that anybody coming off of the elevator or coming out of the stairwell would not see anyone who was down in a firing position between the barricade and the window.
They were still searching when the call came that there had been another shooting.
All we knew at that time was that it was an officer had been shot, and they gave us a car number, and we knew it was Tippett based on the car number.
Officer J.D. Tippett had been patrolling in Oak Cliff when he was gunned down, killed instantly next to his car. Of the 7 eyewitnesses to the shooting, the one with probably the clearest view was Jack Tatum.
I was preparing to turn left on 10th Street from Denver. I noticed an individual walking in my direction with a light zipper jacket on, darker pants, and a squad car pulling over to the curb next to him. As I approached the squad car, I noticed that that individual was leaning over talking to the officer. He had both hands in the pockets of his jacket. I continued through the intersection, and about in the middle of the intersection, I heard 3, maybe 4 shots.
If the man in the jacket was Lee Harvey Oswald, no one knows how he got here. Researcher Dale Myers investigated the Tippett shooting.
He certainly couldn't have gotten here unless he got a ride. Some people have conjectured that it was possibly a conspiratorial pickup.
Whether the driver was a co-conspirator or a casual passerby is still a mystery.
A lot of the witnesses first said that he was coming west, and then he was seen walking east as Tippett pulled to the curb. I think what may have happened is Oswald truly was walking west, saw the police car approaching, did a quick about-face, and now was walking east. This would be something that Tippett would spot, possibly cause enough suspicion to pull over. Killer gets to about this position on the sidewalk, and Tippett's patrol car pulls to the curb, and either calls him over to the curb or the man comes over by himself and leans to the window and talks to Tippett through the vent window for 10 or 20 seconds, very short. And Tippett gets out of the patrol car, and as he does, the man steps over to the front of the hood here, and as Tippett gets opposite him, he pulls a gun from under the jacket, fires 3 shots across the hood, knocking Tippett to the pavement. Then the man starts to leave, hesitates at the back of the car, walks around behind the car, comes up to the front of the car, stands over Tippett, and shoots him in the head.
He then looked around, surveyed the situation, and started a slow run toward my direction. I put my car in gear and drove forward and watched him through the rearview mirror. I saw him very clearly and realized that there was one thing that made him stand out, and that was his mouth that curled up. I couldn't mistake that.
Kind of a smile.
Yes, kind of a smile. And I was within 10, 15 feet of that individual, and it was Lee Harvey Oswald.
After the shooting, police found shells at the scene. They went on the radio and said there were 38 automatics. Later, Oswald's arrested with a revolver that fires 38 specials, a shell that's clearly about a 1/4 inch longer. Besides, they're clearly stamped on the bottom. One says 38 special, one says 38 automatic.
Automatic shells would mean Oswald was not there, and that the evidence could have been planted.
Did you actually pick up the shells yourself?
Yeah, I got a mark in them. I put a mark in them.
But you still mistook the kind of shell it was?
Yes, I did. In all the excitement that was going on then, you just looked to see if it was a 38. And if you'd been using an automatic, they could have been ejected. Nobody at this point had told the first officer to arrive that Oswald had stopped, deliberately kicked out shells from a .38 revolver before he left that scene.
Later, the FBI crime lab found that Tippit was killed by bullets fired from a gun with a bored-out barrel, a barrel just like Oswald's .38. Ballistics tests on bored-out guns can never be completely conclusive. However, marks on the cartridges allegedly recovered at the scene did match the hammer on Oswald's .38 revolver.
Shortly after the shooting, several employees of a used car lot saw the killer come down this street. Ultimately, he came and he ducked behind this building, which used to be a Texaco service station. In 1963, this was a parking lot, and they found a jacket under this car. It was a light gray Eisenhower-type jacket, much like the one that Oswald was seen zipping up as he left his rooming house. He's next seen without the jacket, kind of slinking down Jefferson, ducking in and out of stores as police cars are roaring up and down with their sirens blaring.
As the police cars sped by the Texas movie theater, the cashier stepped out of her ticket booth to see what was happening. As she did, a man slipped past her without buying a ticket. But someone saw him and called the police.
And so we converged on that location. Hit the balcony first, I did. Because there was only one light on in the theater, we opened the side door to get some more light. We determined he wasn't in the balcony, and I came downstairs. As I got back to the lobby, I heard the sounds of a scuffle. I immediately went into the theater. I saw an officer scuffling with a suspect on the third row from the back of the theater. It took 7 of us to put him on the floor and restrain him until we could put cuffs on him. Once we had the cuffs on him, he started hollering police brutality, is this America, this kind of thing.
Outside the movie house, an angry crowd jeered as Oswald was bundled into a police car.
Immediately, as we pulled away from the curb, we got on the radio and said we were going out to jail with our suspect. And the next thing was asked was, what's your name? And he wouldn't tell us. And asked him, did he know why we had arrested him? And he said, I haven't done anything I should be ashamed of. We continued to the city hall, pulled to the back side of the basement. We formed up our wedge, walked him through the basement, into the elevator, up to the 3rd floor, and into the interrogation room at the homicide robbery.
As Oswald was brought in for questioning in the Tippit shooting, he was also becoming a suspect in the Kennedy assassination. Police had discovered he was the only employee missing from the school book depository.
Let's keep it quiet. We'll all get it. Hold it down. Has the gentleman been identified?
Yes, sir. He's been identified for killing the officer.
Right. Has any identification been attempted for the killing of the president?
Not yet.
Not yet.
I was in the hallway with all the other reporters when Fritz came out and asked me if I'd come in and sort of be the token reporter inside for a few minutes. And I went in to see Oswald, and I asked him about his eye, and he said that was when he was punched out and knocked down, wrestled down. The next question, why did you kill Officer Tippit? And he threw the question right back at me. He said, someone get killed? Policeman get killed? And at that time, he had this little smirk on him, and I wanted to hit him, but I didn't. Then all of a sudden, it dawned on me he wasn't sweating. Not a drop of sweat on him. He was calmer than all the people around him, Secret Service, police, FBI, district attorney. Everybody was in that office.
Well, he didn't admit anything and didn't confess to anything. He was the type of individual that you'd had to prove to him that we could make a case on him. And this is not unusual. This is very common among people that commit crime.
I don't think he would have broken and confessed. I think he was playing a game. He had the impression that he was smarter than everybody else and was going to sit back there and play this for all it was worth.
The case against Oswald was building. Police had recovered the rifle, and the FBI had traced its purchase to an A. Hiddell.
The return address on this order letter was to the post office box in Dallas, Texas, of our suspect, Oswald. But it has definitely been established by the FBI that the handwriting is the handwriting of Oswald.
He was asked if he had ever used the name of A. Hiddell. He said no, And he asked if he knew anybody named A. Hydell, and he said no. And then he was asked, is it true that when you was arrested you had a picture ID on there with A. Hydell on it? He said, I believe that's correct. And he asked, well, how do you explain that? And he says, I don't. He just cut it off like that.
Here comes Oswald down the hall again.
You find that rifle? That's as fast as you people have been given, but I emphatically deny these charges.
What Oswald's interrogation shows is a very consistent pattern to hide a single fact through lies. That single fact was his ownership of the rifle. When he lied about the backyard photograph, it was to hide the fact he had a rifle. When he lied that he had ever used the alias Hidell, it was to hide the fact that he had ordered the rifle. You could go through the interrogation point by point and see that Oswald will be truthful up until it comes to the rifle. Pointed a rifle, he hides his ownership of it. Now we're talking about the assassination weapon, and lying consistently to hide that shows, in my opinion, a consciousness of guilt on Oswald's part.
I don't know what this is all about.
Kill the president?
No, sir, I didn't. People
How'd you get the black eye?
Sir?
Shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man. Come on, man. The president?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
President?
Oswald was interrogated for 2 days, but he never confessed.
I was allowed to visit with him approximately 8 to 10 minutes. And I asked him, I said, Lee, what Sam Hill's going on? He said, I don't know what they're talking about. I said, Lee, they've got you charged with the death of the president, shooting a police officer. They've got your rifle, they've got your pistol, and you don't know what the Sam Hill's going on. And I became kind of intense at that point and looking into his eyes, and he never did answer, but he finally said, brother, you won't find anything there. And before we could get back to discussing anything of substance and everything, he gets tapped on his shoulder and told that's the end of it.
It was a horrible day. I started crying, and then after a while, the picture of the guy that shot the president came in on TV, and I knew right away that I had seen that guy before, but I couldn't remember from where. And he came into the room. She was quite excited. About 10 minutes after she had arrived, we saw the picture of Oswald on the television. She screamed. We looked at each other. We were terrified. I said, I also know him, Annie, and please don't say anything. I also recognize him as the man who was standing at my door.
Around midnight on November 22nd, Oswald was paraded in front of the press. He had just been charged with the murder of Officer Tippit, and he was about to be charged with the assassination of President Kennedy.
You killed the president? No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
You have been. Nobody said what?
Sir?
Nobody said what?
At the back of the room that night was one man who was not a policeman or a reporter. A man who carried a gun and had underworld connections. His name was Jacob Rubenstein, known as Jack Ruby. In less than 36 hours, he would murder Lee Harvey Oswald.
If the mob had a hand in the president's death, and I think they did, and they induced Oswald to kill the president, it was terribly important that he be silenced, because eventually Oswald, if alive, would testify as to who his associates were, or they ran the risk that he would. And therefore, there's every indication that Ruby stalked and killed Oswald in an effort to silence him.
Jack Ruby was a police informer who owned a striptease club. He made sure that policemen who came to his club were shown a good time.
What kind of a guy was Jack Ruby? Impulsive. He had a quick temper. That's why they called him Sparky. Loved to fight. And if anybody was really out of line, he'd throw him out.
If Jack Ruby knew that you were a law enforcement officer, they always had plenty of liquor, dancing girls, food, or anything else, because he always thought that we may be able to help him.
Yeah, he did give some free drinks around, and of course when the police went down there, you know, he discounted the drinks to them, and he was a fighter. There's no question about that. When we'd get a disturbance call down there, we'd just wait at the bottom of the stairs, because just a few minutes, that guy or whoever was creating the disturbance was going to come falling down the stairs.
Jack Ruby knew people who were members of the Mafia. He had acquaintances from his Chicago days of people that had long prison records, and there's no question that he knew as many people in organized crime or who had criminal records as he knew police on the other side.
In 1963, Sam and Joe Campisi were leading figures in the Dallas underworld.
Yes, Jack knew the Campises and I've seen them together on numerous occasions. Jack ate out there at the Egyptian Lounge, and he'd come in, they'd shake his hand and sit down, and sometimes Joe Campisi would sit with him, and if I came in, or, you know, I'd sit with Jack Ruby and Joe Campisi, I knew, we all knew each other well.
The Campisis were lieutenants of Carlos Marcello, the Mafia boss who had reportedly talked of killing the president.
The Campisis did know Carlos Marcello, because one day I was in Joe Campisi's office, and he called Carlos on the phone, and I talked to Carlos on the phone.
There's the odor of a Mafia hit all around Ruby's murder of Lee Harvey Oswald until you examine both Ruby and his actions over that weekend. There is no credible evidence to show that Jack Ruby acted at the behest of anyone in organized crime. It was personally motivated from day one.
If Ruby was a hitman working for the Mafia, he had already missed one perfect opportunity to silence Oswald.
And I asked him if he was packing a pistol at that midnight press conference, and he said yes. And I said, then why didn't you plug him then? And he says, I was afraid of hitting one of you guys.
After the assassination, Ruby closed the Carousel Club. He spent much of Saturday hanging around Dallas Police Headquarters. That day, Oswald was taken from his cell several times to be interrogated and made to stand in police lineups. Ruby had no opportunity to shoot Oswald that day, but he was asking lots of questions about when the police would transfer him to the county jail.
I've been photographing the teacher, and now they're saying we're going to go out among these men, that one will be kicked out. Right?
As he hung around the corridors of the police station that weekend, Ruby seemed distraught over Kennedy's death.
I view Ruby as very agitated. He gets very worked up into this very anti-Oswald feeling. There are a number of events that take place that sort of seem to propel him at even a faster rate into what I view as this emotional deterioration. One of them is the belief that the Jewish community in Dallas is going to be blamed for the assassination based upon an ad that had run the day the president arrived, signed by a Jewish name.
Signed by a Bernard Weissman, the right-wing ad in the Dallas Morning News had attacked Kennedy for being soft on communism. If Ruby was stalking Oswald, Sunday morning would be his last chance. The police had announced Oswald would be transferred to the county jail at 10 a.m. But at 10, Jack Ruby was still at home.
Jack Ruby takes over an hour and a half to leave his apartment. He very leisurely goes to the Western Union office. He doesn't appear to be rushed, says the clerk behind the counter, and he sends his $25 MoneyGram. He takes his change, and it's time-stamped at 11:17. Oswald is shot by Ruby 4 minutes later at 11:21.
I did a recheck on that myself from the date stamp time of 11:17 on that telegram, and then it took roughly 83 seconds because I walked at 3 different speeds, slow, fast, and medium, and the average was 83 seconds from the front door of the Western Union to the basement.
It is still unclear whether Ruby slipped into the basement through an unlocked door or just walked down the ramp. Upstairs, Jim Lavelle was about to bring Oswald down in the elevator, more than an hour late.
But I had no idea when I was coming down the elevator, and he certainly could not have. And there was no way you could time that where he would be in the basement right at the exact moment that I came out of there. And he couldn't have been there more than a minute to 45 seconds to a minute before I arrived. But Oswald.
Wearing a light-colored suit and a Stetson, Lavelle was Oswald's escort.
I put the handcuffs on him, and in the process of doing that, I more in jest kind of said, "Lee, if anybody shoots at you, I hope you're as good a shot as you are," meaning, of course, that they'd hit him and not me. And he kind of laughed, and he said, "Oh, you're being melodramatic," or something to that effect. "Nobody's going to shoot at me." And so we walked out, and I was momentarily blinded by those lights. I couldn't see anything. Oswald just groaned when he was shot, just and went down, and that's the only sound he made.
Ruby yells as he's shooting, "You killed my president, you rat." He's then tackled by the police around him, and in the few seconds after the shooting, through the time he's taken into jail, he says a series of things. You guys, meaning the police, couldn't do it. I did it for you. I had to show that a Jew has guts. I'm happy that I got him. There's a whole series of where Ruby believes they're going to clap him on the back and say, "Nice going, Jack."
Was the shooting in the basement garage a carefully planned mafia hit? Or did Sparky Ruby shoot Oswald in a flash of violent rage?
I transferred Jack Ruby to the county jail, and when I asked him why he'd done the shooting, he said he'd thought about it from the Friday night on, but a lot of people thought about it. Now, I've had people tell me, "Oh, if I got to him on Friday afternoon, my anger was such that I would have killed him without looking back."
When I visited Jack in prison, the first thing he said, he was smiling at the time, you know, and he looked at me and he said, "I got balls, ain't that, baby?" And I said, "Yeah, Jack, and they gonna hang you by him, too."
But Ruby had other, more sinister visitors.
Sam and JoJo Campese would visit with Jack Ruby, and they always had privacy.
Those private meetings with the Campeses reawakened suspicions of a mob hit. Yet even men who believe the mafia killed Kennedy and Oswald concede the evidence is not conclusive.
If I posit the fact of a conspiracy, the one that is most plausible is that the mob had a hand in it. It is a probability judgment based on all the evidence. It's not the kind of thing that you'd take into court and try to prove beyond a reasonable doubt as a prosecutor.
When he spoke to the press after his trial, Ruby himself hinted at conspiracy, but by now his mental condition was deteriorating.
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
In Ruby's televised statement and in other statements, he did believe there was more to the case than just his simple shooting of Oswald. He thought there was a massive conspiracy, one by the district attorney and by right-wing elements to frame him and to further embarrass the Jewish community in Dallas. That is what Jack Ruby is talking about in this case.
Oswald never regained consciousness after Jack Ruby shot him.
Captain, where will he be taken? I'm assuming Parkland Hospital. Parkland Hospital, the irony of ironies, the place where President John F. Kennedy died. The armored car now has been cleared out of the entranceway. The ambulance is leaving Dallas Police Headquarters.
So I was riding in the back with him, holding his hand, arm, trying to reach a pulse. The doctor was massaging his chest, trying to get him to breathe. And he groaned and stretched a little bit and then just went completely limp. And actually, that's when I think he expired, was then, because I never saw him make another move at all.
Oswald was pronounced dead at Parkland Hospital. His death meant the evidence against him would never be tested in court. But 30 years later, the strength of that case continues to grow. Significant evidence may have been overlooked by all the official investigations. Soon after the shots were fired, Dallas police dusted the murder weapon and found partial fingerprints near the trigger guard and a clear palm print on the barrel. At police headquarters, the palm print was lifted from the rifle for examination. But when the FBI rushed the rifle to Washington, the palm print stayed in Dallas, and a clear chain of evidence was broken. Amid 30 years of accusations that the police had planted the palm print on the rifle, the latent fingerprints on the trigger guard have been largely ignored. Vincent Scalise, a leading fingerprint expert, examined all the fingerprint evidence for the House Assassinations Committee.
The FBI examined these latent prints and they determined that they were worthless for identification purposes. I re-examined the photograph of these latent prints again in 1978 for the Select Committee on Assassinations and came to the same conclusion. Due to the faintness of the prints, I determined that they were of no value for identification purposes.
But 30 years ago, the Dallas police had evidence that might have changed that judgment. Rusty Livingstone was on duty in the Dallas Crime Lab on November 22nd. He developed pictures taken at the crime scene. He also processed photographs of the rifle and of the latent fingerprints on its trigger guard. Livingstone made several sets of photographs, including one for himself. But he didn't realize the significance of the fingerprint photographs until he began working with his nephew, Gary Savage, on a book about the assassination.
The wonderful thing about this is first-day evidence. This is original evidence collected by the Dallas police. This stuff didn't go through the Warren Commission. It didn't go through the House Select Committee on Assassination.
The FBI says it never looked at the Dallas police photographs of the fingerprints. And experts for the Warren Commission and the House Assassinations Committee never examined all of the fingerprint photographs. But this year, a local police captain, Jerry Powdrell, re-examined all the evidence. He compared the inked fingerprints taken from Oswald in New Orleans with the pictures of the fingerprints found on the trigger guard.
It appears that the fingerprints depicted in the photographs came from the right hand. I found 3 points of identity and 3 possible points of identity during this comparison. Law enforcement community uses 6 to 10 points of identity for positive identification.
Powdrell's analysis was not conclusive, but he found nothing to indicate the prints were not Oswald's. A former high-ranking FBI fingerprint expert who examined the prints for Frontline said they were simply not clear enough to make any identification. But Vincent Scalise, the House Assassination Committee expert, came to a very different conclusion.
There were a total of 4 photographs in all. That I began to examine them, I saw 2 faint prints. And as I examined them, I realized that these prints had been taken at different exposures. And it was necessary for me to utilize all of the photographs to compare against the ink prints. As I examined them, I found that by maneuvering the photographs in different positions, I was able to pick up some details on one photograph and some details on another photograph. Using all of the photographs at different contrasts, I was able to find in the neighborhood of about 18 points of identity between the 2 prints. Well, I feel that this is a major breakthrough in this investigation because we're able for the first time to actually say that these are definitely the fingerprints of Lee Harvey Oswald and that they are on the rifle. There is no doubt about it.
The prosecution case against Oswald is open and shut. If he'd shot his brother-in-law in the back seat of a convertible and not the President of the United States, he would have been tried, convicted, and forgotten in 3 days. But for the fact that it's the President, this is an easy case.
Three days after the assassination, Washington and the world mourned President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. In Dallas, the police honored Officer J.D. Tippit. And on that same day in Fort Worth, the remains of Lee Harvey Oswald were laid to rest. But the questions about his role in the assassination have lived on for 30 years.
True, no one saw him actually pull the trigger on the president. But his rifle's there. His presence in the buildings was there. What he did after he left the building is known. Bus ride, taxi ride, boarding house, pick up the pistol, shoot the police officer, eyewitnesses there, 5 or 6. You can't set that aside just because he is saying, I'm a patsy. I'd love to do that, but you cannot, in my mind, set that aside.
The question is not, did Lee Harvey Oswald shoot the president? The question is, did he have help? Within 30 hours of the assassination, that was the question. 30 years later, that remains to be the question.
John Kennedy had many enemies. The Mafia and many Cuban exiles celebrated his death, and Lee Harvey Oswald's life may have intersected with those forces. But there is no evidence that they changed the trajectory of his life, and they cannot be found in Dallas, influencing him to act. In the end, there is only Oswald, a man who chose his own politics, invented his own secret life, and made himself into an assassin, a man whose real life never measured up to the scale of his dreams, until the day the President of the United States passed right in front of him.
This is a struggle that has gone on with me for almost 30 years now. This is mind over heart. The mind tells me one thing, the heart tells me something else. But the facts are there, and I say to people who want to distort the facts and pick them out, I say, what do you do with his rifle? What do you do with his pistol? What do you do with his general opportunity? What do you do with his actions? To me, you can't reach but one conclusion. There's hard physical evidence there. It's good that people raise questions and say, wait a minute, let's take a second look at this. I think that's great, you know. But when you take the second look and the third and the 40th and the 50th, hey, enough's enough. It's there. Put it to rest.
There will always be one final mystery. Why did Oswald choose Kennedy? But the solution cannot be found in the dark corridors of crime, espionage, and power. That question can only be answered by one young man. And his answer will always be silence.